It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Max stumbled upon the old leather-bound journal in the back of the attic. Dust motes swirled lazily in the sunlight streaming through the small, circular window. He had been cleaning up after years of neglect in the family house when his hand brushed against something smooth, hidden beneath a pile of forgotten books and boxes. The journal was worn, its pages yellowed with age, but there was something about it that pulled him in. Max wasn't much for reading old family heirlooms, but there was an undeniable urge to flip through its pages. As he opened it, the first thing that struck him was the handwriting. It wasn't just neat or careful. It had a rhythm to it, a sense of urgency. The words danced across the page in a way that made him feel like they were meant for someone else, as if he were intruding on a secret. The ink had faded over time, but Max could still make out the words. They spoke of something far beyond his comprehension. The first few pages outlined a man's obsession with time, more specifically with time travel. Max thought it was fiction, an old science fiction story his great-grandfather had written. But then he stumbled upon a diagram, a blueprint of sorts that made his heart race. The design looked like a mechanical device, something that would change everything. Max read on, each word pulling him deeper into the mystery. The journal described the device as a chronosphere, a machine capable of bending time itself. The more Max read, the more he realized that this wasn't just a fantasy. It was something much more real, something his great-grandfather had built. His mind raced as he thought about what this could mean. Time travel? It sounded absurd, like something from a movie, but the evidence in front of him was undeniable. There were notes on the mechanics of the chronosphere, drawings of gears, levers, and intricate electrical wiring that suggested the possibility of manipulating time in ways that Max couldn't begin to understand. But what caught his attention most was a passage at the very end of the journal. "It is done," the journal said. "The chronosphere is complete. The only question that remains is whether I am brave enough to use it." Max had heard stories of his great-grandfather, how he was a brilliant inventor who disappeared mysteriously decades ago, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he had gone in search of something beyond time. But now, Max couldn't help but wonder if the truth was far stranger than anyone had ever imagined. Max sat in the attic, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages of the journal. The weight of what he had just uncovered pressed down on him. He wasn't sure if he should feel excitement or fear, but one thing was certain: he was no longer just a passive observer of his family's history. He was caught in the web of something bigger, something that could change the course of his life and perhaps the world. The idea of time travel seemed impossible, and yet, as he read the final pages of the journal, it became clear that his great-grandfather had believed it was possible. Max wasn't a scientist, but the descriptions of the chronosphere sounded plausible, if only just. The journal was filled with detailed explanations of the device's purpose and function. The time machine, as it was described, would allow a person to travel through time, observing past events or even changing them. Max couldn't help but imagine the possibilities. What if he could travel back to the day his parents had passed away? What if he could stop the car accident that had shattered his life? Or maybe he could visit his younger self, offer him advice, and change the course of his own decisions. The temptation was overwhelming. But there was a problem. Max didn't know how to build the chronosphere. The journal was filled with diagrams and calculations, but the device's complexity was beyond his knowledge. He was just an ordinary man, not a genius inventor like his great-grandfather. And even if he could somehow construct the machine, would it even work? Could he really trust something so fantastical? Max closed the journal and sat back against the dusty attic wall. His mind was racing with questions. Time travel was a dream for many, a concept explored in countless books and movies, but to actually build a machine that could make it a reality? It seemed impossible. Yet, the journal didn't suggest fantasy. It suggested that his great-grandfather had done it. Max couldn't ignore the possibility. He had to make a decision. Should he pursue this insane idea? Should he try to build the chronosphere and see if it could actually work? Or should he let it go, leaving the mysteries of time to the pages of an old journal and the whispers of a long-gone relative? Max thought of the life he had, ordinary, uneventful, and unremarkable. It wasn't a bad life, but it was a life that left him feeling like something was missing. Perhaps this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to do something extraordinary. Time travel could give him the answers he had spent years searching for, even if the journey was dangerous or uncertain. But then, he thought of the warning his great-grandfather had left at the end of the journal. Asterisk, the question that remains is whether I am brave enough to use it. Asterisk. Max took a deep breath. He knew the answer. He had to try. He couldn't let fear hold him back from something this incredible. He would build the chronosphere, and if it worked, he would test it. He would become the person his great-grandfather had never been. Someone who had the courage to face the unknown. Max stood up, the journal still clutched in his hands. He had a lot of work ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of purpose, a sense of excitement that had been absent from his life for far too long. Whatever came next, he was ready. Part 3. Gathering the pieces ***. Max wasted no time. He knew he had to start somewhere, and the first step was to decipher the diagrams in the journal. As he sat at his desk that night, surrounded by open books, sketches, and electrical schematics, it dawned on him how little he actually understood about the concepts his great-grandfather had written about. Time travel was not just a matter of theoretical physics. It was about manipulating the very fabric of existence. The diagrams were intricate, each line and curve representing a complex mechanism. But the meaning of it all still eluded Max. The journal didn't provide clear instructions on how to construct the chronosphere. It was more of a collection of thoughts, ideas, and partially completed designs. His great-grandfather had clearly been brilliant, but the work had been abandoned. Max felt the weight of that abandonment, knowing that whatever had caused his great-grandfather to leave the project unfinished had to be something significant. Max spent the next few weeks researching the principles of time travel, studying anything that could provide him with the scientific foundation to understand the chronosphere. He learned about the theories of relativity, the idea of wormholes, and the concept of parallel universes. But none of it helped him make sense of the device. He knew the journal spoke of something far beyond current science, something almost magical in its design. One evening, Max decided to take a different approach. He realized that his great-grandfather's journal was more than just a technical manual. It was a personal account. It described the inventor's thoughts, fears, and experiences as he grappled with the idea of time travel. Perhaps the answers Max was seeking weren't hidden in equations or formulas, but in the emotions and mindset his great-grandfather had shared. Max began rereading the journal from the beginning, not just for the technical details but for the subtle clues his great-grandfather had left behind. There were moments in the journal where the inventor seemed to wrestle with his own sense of guilt, as if he were torn between the thrill of discovery and the moral implications of tampering with time. He came across a passage that particularly caught his attention. The consequences of altering time are more than theoretical, they are felt in the very core of the universe. Time is not a river, as they say, but an intricate web. Every decision creates ripples that affect the entire structure of existence. What I am about to do may not just change my life, but the lives of everyone in this world. Max stopped reading and leaned back in his chair. The words weighed heavily on him. It was one thing to build the chronosphere, but quite another to use it. What if his great-grandfather had never used it because he realized the risks were too great? What if the device had destroyed him, or worse, the world itself? Max didn't have answers, but he couldn't let go of the idea. He needed to continue, needed to see if the machine was truly feasible. If there was a way to safely use it, he would find it. The next step was to gather the materials. The chronosphere required rare and complex components, including advanced metals, circuits, and even some unknown materials that Max couldn't identify. He scoured the internet, visited specialty shops, and talked to engineers. Many of the parts were highly specialized, and some didn't even exist yet. It felt like an impossible task, but the more Max searched, the more he found that some of the things his great-grandfather had described were surprisingly close to what modern technology was beginning to explore. One day, Max came across a website that sold experimental equipment used in quantum physics research. There, he found something that made his heart skip a beat, an alloy that was described as time-resistant. It was a material designed to withstand extreme fluctuations in time and space, something Max never imagined would be possible. He quickly placed an order for the material, knowing that this was a critical step in bringing the chronosphere to life. Weeks turned into months as Max assembled the components and continued his research. Every day he felt closer to something monumental, but the burden of what he was about to attempt began to weigh on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a dangerous line, but he had come too far to turn back now. The chronosphere was becoming more than just a machine. It was a chance to rewrite his own story, to change his past, and perhaps to change the world. Max stood in his workshop late one night, the hum of machinery filling the silence as he carefully pieced together the final components of the chronosphere. His hands were steady now, having worked tirelessly on the device for months. Each part had been painstakingly crafted or modified to fit the specifications laid out in his great-grandfather's journal. The alloy had arrived just days ago, and Max had already begun incorporating it into the frame of the machine. It was shiny, almost otherworldly in its appearance, and it radiated an energy that made Max uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. His progress had been slow but steady. With every new piece he attached, Max felt a growing sense of anticipation, as if the chronosphere itself were calling to him. He would stand back every so often, examining his work from a distance, and see the machine taking shape. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. A complex mix of gears, wires, and glowing lights, each section of the device seeming to pulse with potential. But there was something else, something Max couldn't quite put his finger on. He had begun to feel as though the chronosphere wasn't just a machine. It was almost alive. The more time he spent around it, the more it seemed to hum with energy, as though it were waiting for something. It was unsettling, but Max brushed the feeling aside. He had a job to do. The journal had provided enough instructions for him to assemble the machine, but there was one part that still baffled him. A section of the blueprint depicted a strange mechanism, a set of dials and switches that Max couldn't quite understand. The instructions in the journal were vague, written in a hurried, almost frantic tone, as if his great-grandfather had been rushing to finish the design before something, or someone, stopped him. There were several references to a control mechanism, but it was never explained in detail. Max had stared at this part of the blueprint for weeks, trying to make sense of it. It seemed like a critical component, and without it, the chronosphere wouldn't function. But no matter how many times he re-examined the diagrams, the purpose of the mechanism eluded him. It was around midnight when he finally decided to stop trying to make sense of it on his own. He needed help. His great-grandfather had built this machine, and there was a chance that he had left behind some kind of clue. A hint, perhaps, that would make everything fall into place. Max had already gone through the journal with a fine-toothed comb, but what if there was something more? What if there was another layer to the story, something hidden in plain sight? He decided to revisit the old family archives. The archives were kept in a dusty room at the back of the house, filled with boxes of old letters, photographs, and forgotten relics from past generations. Max had never paid much attention to them before, but tonight he felt a pull to go through them. He had to know if there were any additional documents, any letters or notes from his great-grandfather that might shed light on the final piece of the puzzle. Max spent hours rummaging through the boxes, flipping through faded papers and worn-out books. He found old family photographs, many of which he had seen before, but there was nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. The clock ticked on, and just as Max was about to give up, he found something that made his heart race. It was a letter, tucked away in a manila envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. The letter was dated just a week before his great-grandfather had disappeared. It was addressed to Max's father, who had been a child at the time. Max recognized the handwriting instantly. It was his great-grandfather's. With trembling hands, Max opened the letter. It read, "To my dear son, I have come to a terrible realization. The chronosphere, while completed, is too dangerous. I have made a grave mistake in my obsession with time. The machine cannot be used without consequences. I have been warned by those who know more than I, and I fear the day will come when I will be forced to make a choice. Use the machine and risk undoing everything, or destroy it and leave the world unchanged. I will not see that day come. I will make sure the chronosphere is never used, no matter the cost. If you are reading this, know that I did not abandon you. I left because I had no choice. I only hope you can forgive me for what I am about to do. With all my love, Grandfather *. Max sat in stunned silence. The letter sent a chill through him, and he couldn't breathe for a moment. His great-grandfather had known the dangers. He had been aware of the consequences, yet he had still pushed forward. But the real question was, why hadn't Max's father ever mentioned this? Why had his grandfather kept this secret? Max's mind was spinning. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the uncertainty remained. His great-grandfather had left behind the machine, and now Max had inherited it. The question was no longer whether he should build the chronosphere, it was whether he should use it. Max stood there, staring at the letter in his hands, the weight of his great-grandfather's words sinking in. The letter was a confession, a warning, and an admission of guilt all wrapped into one. His great-grandfather had realized the dangers of the chronosphere too late. He had understood that tampering with time was a perilous act, one that could unravel everything. Yet, in spite of the grave warnings, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something momentous. The chronosphere had the power to change everything, to rewrite history, to give him a second chance. But at what cost? Max paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had the device, the knowledge, and the determination to continue what his great-grandfather had started. But now the stakes felt higher. It was no longer just a scientific project, it was a moral dilemma. What if using the chronosphere wasn't just dangerous for him, but for the entire world? Could he live with the consequences of altering the past, even if it was for something as personal as saving his parents or preventing his great-grandfather's downfall? The more Max thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't a decision he could make lightly. The machine was almost complete, just a few more adjustments, and it would be ready for testing. But every time he reached for a tool, every time he set his hands on the device, the letter loomed in his mind, reminding him of the risks involved. The memory of his parents, how they had died in a car crash when Max was just a teenager, had haunted him for years. The loss had shaped his life in ways he couldn't even explain. He had often dreamed of going back to that day to warn them, to stop the accident before it happened. But now, with the chronosphere within his reach, the possibility of making that dream a reality seemed too tempting to resist. Max took a deep breath, trying to calm his swirling thoughts. He had always prided himself on being a rational, logical person. But when it came to something as monumental as time travel, all logic seemed to evaporate. How could he possibly understand the full implications of his actions? The very fabric of reality could be at stake. It was then that he remembered another part of the letter, a small but significant detail he had overlooked earlier. His great-grandfather had written, "I fear the day will come when I will be forced to make a choice. Use the machine and risk undoing everything, or destroy it and leave the world unchanged." The implication was clear. The decision had been left to Max. His great-grandfather had gone to great lengths to hide the chronosphere, to ensure it would never be used. But now that it was in Max's hands, the choice was his to make. Max sat down on the edge of the workbench, his head in his hands. His heart ached with the weight of the decision ahead. He could feel the pull of temptation, urging him to press forward, to activate the chronosphere and see what lay beyond. But he couldn't ignore the warning. What if he was making a mistake? What if he was about to unleash something far worse than he could ever imagine? Time, Max realized, was far more complex than he had ever understood. It wasn't just a sequence of events. It was fragile, delicate, and unpredictable. What if he changed something small, and the ripple effects altered the world in ways he couldn't anticipate? What if by saving his parents, he set off a chain of events that led to a far worse outcome? What if the universe itself resisted the changes he tried to make, creating even greater chaos in the process? Max closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind. The decision had to be made carefully. But how could he trust himself to make such a monumental choice? Could he be the one to decide the fate of the world? Max had never been one for superstition or fate. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, it felt as though the world itself was conspiring to push him toward the chronosphere. Every hour spent in the workshop was an hour spent in a constant tug-of-war between his doubts and his desires. He couldn't deny the allure of what the machine represented. If it worked, if it truly allowed him to change the course of time, then everything he had lost, the pain, the grief, the regret, could be rewritten. It was a few days after he had read his great-grandfather's letter that Max decided to take the first step. He couldn't simply sit there, torn between action and inaction. The chronosphere was almost complete, and all the signs, his great-grandfather's warnings, the materials he had gathered, the research he had pored over, pointed to one undeniable truth: the machine was ready. But before he could make a final decision about whether to use it to alter his past, he had to test it. Max had spent countless hours assembling the device, ensuring every cog, every wire, was in place. He had even installed a set of safety protocols, just in case the machine malfunctioned. But no matter how many precautions he took, there was an underlying fear, a nagging suspicion that something would go wrong. He had no way of knowing how the chronosphere would behave once it was powered on. The first test would be small, Max decided. He couldn't risk altering the past, yet. Instead, he would use the machine to observe, to test its functionality without any major consequences. He set the machine to travel to a time just a few days before the present. He would see if it worked, if it could transport him to the past without causing any harm to the fabric of reality. If that worked, he would think about his next steps. Max took a deep breath and activated the chronosphere. The device whirred to life, its gears turning and lights flashing in a strange, rhythmic pattern. For a moment, nothing happened. Max waited, holding his breath. But then, the machine emitted a soft hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate with his very bones. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as if the space itself were bending. The walls of his workshop faded, and the floor beneath him seemed to dissolve. Max felt a sharp pull in his chest, as though the world was being torn apart and put back together again. He closed his eyes, not out of fear, but because the sensation was so overwhelming, he couldn't bear to see it. When he opened them again, he was no longer in his workshop. The room was gone. The familiar walls, the tools scattered across the desk. They were all replaced by a different place entirely. Max blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He looked around, recognizing a street corner, an intersection he knew well. He was standing in front of a grocery store, the same one he had walked past every day when he was a child. The surroundings were exactly as he remembered them, right down to the faded sign hanging over the door. The date on the sign read April 10th, 2003. Max froze. It worked. He had traveled back to his childhood. His heart raced as he took in the scene before him. People bustled about, oblivious to his presence. Cars drove past, and the world moved in its usual rhythm. Everything was just as it had been when he was growing up, and yet it was different. There was a distance between him and this world, as though he were an outsider peering in on a moment in time that no longer belonged to him. Max felt the urge to reach out, to interact with the world around him, but he stopped himself. He didn't want to risk altering anything. The machine had worked, but what would happen if he changed even the smallest detail? What if the consequences were irreversible? He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the life he had once known unfold around him. The feeling of being a ghost, of existing in a past that wasn't his, was both exhilarating and haunting. He wanted to see more, to walk through the streets of his old neighborhood, to visit his parents, to relive the moments that had shaped his life. But the warnings in his great-grandfather's letter echoed in his mind. Time is delicate. Every decision creates ripples. Max knew he couldn't stay here for long. He had come to test the machine, not to change anything. But as the minutes passed, the temptation to stay, to change something, grew stronger. What if he went to the day of the accident? What if he warned his parents? He had the power. He had the means. The question was, did he have the courage to use it? Max made the decision then. He would leave, return to the present, and think about what he had learned. The chronosphere was real. It worked. But there was no telling what would happen if he stayed any longer. Time, it seemed, was not as simple as he had imagined. He activated the chronosphere again, and in an instant the world around him blurred. The familiar street corner disappeared, and he was back in his workshop. Max slumped into the chair, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had traveled through time. But now, more than ever, he was confronted with the impossible question. What next? Max sat in stunned silence, the workshop now feeling eerily quiet in comparison to the chaotic world he had just left. His pulse thudded in his ears, and his mind raced to catch up with what had just occurred. He had done it. He had traveled through time. But even as he marveled at the machine's success, an unsettling question gnawed at the back of his mind. What if the next time he didn't come back? Max rubbed his temples, trying to calm his nerves. The first test had been successful. He had returned, after all. But the experience had left him with more questions than answers. The world he had visited was so vivid, so real. He had been able to move around it, to observe without being seen. But what if that wasn't all time travel was? What if the more he traveled, the more he risked unraveling the world he had left behind? His great-grandfather's warnings loomed larger now than ever before. The letter Max had discovered weeks earlier was no longer just a piece of family history. It was a cautionary tale. The chronosphere was powerful, too powerful. But that power didn't come without consequences. Max had experienced the ripple effects of altering time in a small way by simply stepping into the past. What would happen if he truly changed something? He thought back to the day of the accident. His parents' deaths had haunted him for years. The grief had shaped every decision he had made since that fateful day. In some ways, it had been the driving force behind his obsession with the chronosphere. He wanted to go back, to warn them, to prevent the tragedy that had turned his life upside down. But the question was, did he have the right to do that? Did anyone have the right to change the course of history? Max knew he couldn't answer that yet. He needed time to think, to understand what the true cost of time travel might be. With a heavy sigh, Max stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, bathed in the soft light of early morning. The world, so vast, so full of possibilities, felt both endless and fragile. Max couldn't help but feel like a tiny cog in a machine much larger than himself. A machine that had been running for billions of years, with no regard for the small, personal desires of one man. He stared at his reflection in the window, the face of a man who had just touched the infinite, and yet found himself lost in it. There was a part of him that longed to use the chronosphere to rewrite his own story, to reverse the pain, the loss. But there was also a voice deep inside him. A voice that had always been there, quiet but persistent, that told him he couldn't. There was something sacred about time, something he had never fully appreciated until now. Max closed his eyes, trying to focus, to find some clarity amidst the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The chronosphere was a gift, but it was also a burden. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't just use it recklessly. Time wasn't a playground for second chances. It was a delicate balance, one that could be destroyed if tampered with too freely. As he opened his eyes again, the decision became clearer. He had to put the chronosphere aside for now. He needed to learn more, to understand the consequences of his actions before he moved forward. This wasn't something he could rush into. The risks were too great. Max returned to his workbench, his resolve hardening with each step. He carefully disconnected the machine from its power source, securing it in a way that would prevent accidental activation. It wasn't that he had given up on the idea of changing the past. No, he couldn't let go of that hope. But for now, it would have to wait. The more he considered the implications, the more he understood that he needed time, real time, to think things through. With the chronosphere powered down and silent, Max felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time in months, he felt like he was in control again. The machine wasn't in control of him. As the days passed, Max found himself immersing in other aspects of his life. He spent time with friends, focused on his work, and even took up hobbies he had abandoned years ago. The chronosphere, though still an ever-present thought, was no longer the all-consuming obsession it had once been. But there was always that lingering thought, that temptation to return to the past. What would happen if he used the machine again? What if he could change everything, right the wrongs of his life? The dream was alive, burning quietly in the back of his mind. But every time Max considered using the chronosphere again, the image of his great-grandfather's letter would flash in his mind. "I have made a grave mistake in my obsession with time," it read. "The consequences of altering time are more than theoretical. They are felt in the very core of the universe." Max knew, deep down, that his great-grandfather had been right. Time travel was not something to be taken lightly. It wasn't a game. It wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about respecting the delicate balance of existence itself. For now, Max would wait. But he knew one thing for certain. The question of whether or not to use the chronosphere would never truly go away. It was only a matter of time. Days turned into weeks, and the temptation to test the chronosphere again only grew. Max tried to move on, tried to bury the feeling that had gnawed at him ever since he stepped into the past. But every time he looked at the machine, sitting dormant in the corner of the workshop, that voice in the back of his mind whispered, urging him to act. Max's life, once filled with curiosity and purpose, now seemed empty without the relentless drive to finish what he had started. His friends noticed the change in him, the lingering restlessness in his eyes that no amount of distraction could cure. They had never known the version of Max who had been obsessed with time travel, the one who spent sleepless nights poring over equations and research. To them, he was just the scientist, the curious one. But Max knew the truth. His greatest creation had become his greatest burden. It wasn't just the machine. It was the knowledge that he had the power to alter history, to rewrite his own past, and the looming question of whether he should. That power had become an invisible force, one that pulled at his very soul, bending his thoughts and desires in ways he couldn't control. The worst part was that Max knew he wasn't alone in this struggle. His great-grandfather had felt it too. The obsession, the pull of time, the weight of every decision, every possibility, every outcome. Max could feel it now, an almost physical pressure, a presence that seemed to hang over him like a storm cloud. One evening, as Max sat at his workbench, staring at the chronosphere, a sudden thought struck him. What if there were others like him? What if time travelers had existed throughout history, and they had faced the same dilemmas, the same temptation to rewrite their lives? What if, in their desperation, they had altered the course of history in ways they could never have imagined? Max's great-grandfather had written about his fears, but what if he hadn't been the only one to discover the machine's true power? What if there were other time travelers, people who had used the chronosphere or similar devices before him? He had no way of knowing. The journal his great-grandfather had left behind didn't mention anyone else. But the more Max thought about it, the more it seemed likely that there were hidden forces at play. Forces that had shaped the world in ways Max couldn't comprehend. In the midst of his musings, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He glanced up, startled, and quickly wiped his hands on his pants. He wasn't expecting anyone. The door opened slowly, and in walked a man Max had never seen before. The man was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room as soon as he entered. He wore a simple black jacket, but there was something about his presence that suggested he was no ordinary visitor. "Maxwell Hayden?" the man asked, his voice calm but insistent. Max stood up, instinctively taking a step back. "Yes, who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the workshop, his eyes sweeping over the workbench and the tools scattered about. Max could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze, as if he were assessing him, calculating something. "I know what you've been working on," the man said finally, his eyes locking onto Max's. "I know what you've discovered." Max's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how this man knew about the chronosphere, but there was something in his tone that sent a chill down Max's spine. "How do you know about the chronosphere?" The man smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "Let's just say I've been watching you for some time. You've been doing very dangerous work, Maxwell. And it's not just you who's been affected. Max felt his breath catch in his throat. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who are you? What do you mean by affected? The man stepped closer, his expression serious now. I'm someone who has been involved with time for a long time. People like you, people who have the ability to manipulate it, don't realize the consequences of their actions. Time doesn't like to be tampered with. And when you start meddling with it, there are forces that will intervene. Max felt his pulse quicken. This was insane. How could this man know all of this? How could he possibly understand what Max had been through? You're not the first one to stumble upon time travel, the man continued, his voice low but firm. And you won't be the last. But you need to understand something. There are others out there who have made far more drastic changes to history than you can imagine. And they've paid the price for it. Max took a step forward, his confusion and frustration mounting. What are you talking about? What price? The man paused, his eyes darkening. The more you manipulate time, the more it fights back. There are forces, organizations, groups who monitor these disruptions. They've been keeping track of time travelers for centuries. And they will do whatever it takes to stop anyone from altering the timeline too drastically. Max's mind was reeling. He had thought he was alone in this journey, that the chronosphere was his to control. But now, it seemed, there was a much larger web at play. A network of people and forces that were aware of the dangers he had just begun to understand. I'm not here to warn you, the man said, his voice cold. I'm here to make sure you understand what you're dealing with. You're already walking a fine line, Maxwell. If you continue, you may find that there are consequences far worse than you could ever imagine. Some things should never be changed. Max stood there, his thoughts tumbling over each other. What had he gotten himself into? Was he really the one in control, or had he simply become a pawn in a much larger game? The man's words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Max truly wondered if he was in over his head. Part 9. The hidden agenda ***. Max stood frozen, trying to process everything the man had just said. The air in the workshop felt thick, heavy with the weight of the stranger's words. The realization that there were others, people who had been watching him, monitoring time travelers, hit him like a cold wave. He had thought he was alone in his discovery, that the chronosphere was his creation, his responsibility. But now it seemed there was much more at stake than he had ever imagined. The man before him didn't look like someone who was here to offer help. There was a calculating look in his eyes, an edge to his voice that made Max uneasy. This wasn't a chance meeting, it was deliberate. And that could only mean one thing. The man knew exactly who Max was and what he was capable of. You're saying there are organizations? People who keep track of time travelers? Max asked, trying to steady his voice. The man gave a curt nod. Yes, you think the idea of time travel is a new discovery, but it's far older than you realize. There are groups that have been watching over time for centuries. Sometimes they intervene, sometimes they wait, but they never let anyone tamper with history without consequences. Max's mind raced. What kind of organizations could possibly have been monitoring time travel for centuries? How had they known about him, about his work? How do you know all of this? Max asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. The man's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm not here to explain all the details, but I am here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions. Time doesn't like being tampered with. It reacts. And when it does, it's not always predictable. Max's thoughts were a blur. He had believed he was in control, that the chronosphere was his invention, his responsibility. But now he was starting to question everything. Was he truly in control? Or had he unknowingly stepped into something far larger than himself? You said people have paid the price for tampering with time. What does that mean? Max asked, his voice now more forceful. He needed answers. The man's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. The price is different for everyone. Some lose everything they know, friends, family, memories. Others disappear. Time can erase them completely, as though they never existed. There are ways to manipulate history so deeply that it's as if you were never a part of it in the first place. Max's breath caught in his throat. Disappear? Could that happen? Could his existence be wiped away by a single misstep? Is that what happened to your great-grandfather? The man asked suddenly, his tone cutting through Max's thoughts. Is that why he left you the warning? Because he knew what would happen if you kept going. Max flinched at the mention of his great-grandfather. His heart ached with the memory of the man who had once been his mentor, his guide. The man who had dedicated his life to unlocking the mysteries of time. The same man who had now left him with nothing but cryptic warnings. I don't know, Max muttered, his hands trembling slightly. I don't understand what happened to him. He left everything behind, his research, his notes, just to warn me. But he never told me why he stopped. Why he abandoned the work. The man's expression softened just a little, though his eyes still held that calculating edge. He made a choice. He realized the dangers of what he was doing. He realized that once you start down this path, it's not easy to turn back. Some people go too far, and once they do, there's no going back. They become part of the system. Max felt a chill run down his spine. Part of the system. What did that mean? Was his great-grandfather one of those people who had disappeared? Had he been erased from history? What do you want from me? Max finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was tired of the cryptic answers, tired of the half-truths. He needed to know what was going on, and more importantly, what the man wanted from him. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Max's. I want you to understand the gravity of what you're dealing with. I'm not here to stop you. I can't. But I'm here to make sure you don't destroy everything you've ever known in the process. The power you have is not something you can wield without consequences. Time has its own rules, and those rules are not to be broken. Max felt the weight of the man's words settle over him like a cloud. He had thought he understood the risks of time travel. But now, it seemed there were rules he hadn't even considered, rules he had no idea existed. It was as though the universe itself had a system in place to prevent people like him from meddling with the past. And if I choose to keep going? Max asked, his voice trembling slightly. He didn't know why he was asking, perhaps out of some desperate need to understand what he was up against. The man's gaze flickered for a moment, then he responded. If you keep going, Maxwell, you will attract their attention. And when they notice you, you won't be able to escape. Not even with the chronosphere. Max's stomach churned at the thought. Who were they? And what did they want with him? I'm not here to threaten you, the man continued, his tone steady, almost sympathetic. I'm here to warn you. The forces you're playing with are not of your making. And if you continue, you'll find yourself up against something much bigger than you can handle. Max felt his heart pound in his chest. For the first time since he had discovered the chronosphere, he felt truly afraid. The world he had once known, the world he had believed was simple and predictable, now seemed like a fragile illusion. The more he learned, the less he understood. He had wanted to change his past, to fix what was broken. But now, with the weight of this new knowledge, he wondered if he had any right to change anything at all. The man didn't wait for Max to respond. He turned toward the door, his coat swirling behind him as he took a few steps. Before he left, he turned back, his eyes locking with Max's once more. Think carefully, Maxwell. The past is not yours to rewrite. It belongs to time. And with that, the man was gone. Max stood there, alone in the workshop, the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The chronosphere sat silently on the workbench, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Max didn't know what to do anymore. But one thing was clear. He was no longer the only one aware of what the chronosphere could do. And the more he learned, the more he understood that tampering with time came with consequences far beyond his comprehension. Max spent the next few days in a state of confusion. His mind trapped between the warning the mysterious man had given him and his own obsession with the chronosphere. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, with no clear idea of what lay beyond. The weight of the man's words hung over him like a dark cloud, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was teetering on the brink of something much larger than he could control. He tried to return to his normal routine, focusing on work and spending time with his friends, but his mind kept drifting back to the chronosphere. Every time he walked into his workshop, his gaze was drawn to the machine. It sat there, quiet and innocent, but Max knew that if he pressed a single button, everything could change. The temptation to use it again gnawed at him, especially after the man's cryptic warning. The forces watching over time travelers, who were they? Why were they so determined to stop people from altering the past? Max found himself wondering if the man had been telling the truth or if he had some hidden agenda of his own. But deep down, Max couldn't deny that something was off. The man's words had struck a chord, resonating with him in a way he couldn't fully explain. Late one evening, as Max sat at his desk, staring at the notes his great-grandfather had left behind, the door to his workshop creaked open. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Claire's voice was gentle but firm. She had been one of Max's closest friends for years, always supportive, always understanding. But Max knew she was beginning to sense that something was wrong. She had noticed the change in him, the sleepless nights, the distant look in his eyes. He had tried to hide it, but the truth was he was consumed by the machine. Max looked up at her, his eyes tired and filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do, Claire." She walked into the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Max, you're not the same. You've been obsessed with this thing for months now. I get it, okay? You've created something incredible, but it's eating you alive. You need to let it go." Max ran a hand through his hair, frustration and doubt rising within him. "But what if I could fix everything? What if I could go back and change things? I could stop the accident. I could save my parents." Claire's face softened with sympathy, but she didn't look away. "Max, I know how much that loss has affected you. I know how much you've wanted to change things. But you have to face the reality. You can't change the past. No one can. And even if you could, you don't know what the consequences would be." Max swallowed hard, her words hitting him like a cold splash of water. He wanted to argue, wanted to cling to the hope that there was a way to rewrite his past. But deep down, he knew Claire was right. He had always known it, even before he had discovered the chronosphere. The past was gone, and no amount of time travel could bring it back. But the idea of letting go, of accepting the loss, felt impossible. Felt like giving up. "Max, I'm not trying to stop you from chasing your dreams," Claire continued, her voice gentle but resolute. "But you've changed. You're not the person I remember, and I don't want to lose you. Please think about it. What do you really want?" Max looked down at the chronosphere, his fingers tracing the edges of the machine. He could feel the pull, the temptation to use it again, to go back and make things right. But in his heart, he knew it wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about something deeper, something darker. What if he didn't just want to change the past? What if he wanted to control the future? The thought scared him, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. "I don't know what I want anymore," Max admitted softly. "I just want to make it all stop. I want to fix everything." Claire stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Max, you can't fix everything. You can't control everything. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go. You have to trust that things will get better, even if you can't see it right now." Max closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been chasing an illusion, a perfect version of the past that could never exist. But he couldn't help it. The need to change things had become an obsession. The chronosphere had given him a taste of that power, and now he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into something he didn't understand. "What if it's not just about me?" Max asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I'm not the only one affected by time travel?" Claire frowned, clearly puzzled by the sudden shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Max's mind was spinning now, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The mysterious man had spoken about forces monitoring time travelers. Had they been monitoring him for a reason? Was there something more to this whole experiment than he had realized? "What if," Max continued, his voice thick with the weight of the realization. What if I'm not the only one who has the power to change the past? What if there are others, people who have been doing this for a lot longer than me? What if there's a bigger game at play? Claire's face turned pale, and she took a step back. Max, this is getting out of hand. You need to stop. You don't know what you're dealing with. Max shook his head, feeling a surge of panic rising in his chest. He couldn't stop now. There were too many questions, too many uncertainties. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that time travel wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon that could be used by anyone with the knowledge, the power to wield it. I can't just walk away, Max said, his voice firm now. I have to know the truth. Claire's eyes filled with concern, but she said nothing more. She knew Max, and she knew that once he set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. She only hoped he would find the answers he was looking for before it was too late. Max turned back to the chronosphere, his thoughts swirling with uncertainty and fear. He knew he had reached a tipping point. The choice he made now would define everything, the future, the past, and everything in between. But what if he was making the biggest mistake of his life? The days following his conversation with Claire felt like a blur to Max. He was caught between the pull of his obsession with the chronosphere and the heavy burden of the warning he had received. The fear of tampering with time, of becoming one of the people erased from history, weighed heavily on his mind. But no matter how hard he tried to push it away, the temptation to use the machine again persisted. Max sat at his workbench, staring at the chronosphere. The hum of the machine seemed louder now, more insistent. It was as if it were calling to him, urging him to take the next step. He knew the risks, knew the potential consequences of his actions, but the thought of undoing the past, of being able to save his parents, to fix what had been broken, was too powerful to ignore. Claire had been right about one thing. He wasn't the same person anymore. His need to control the past had consumed him, and he wasn't sure if there was any way to escape it now. The chronosphere had given him a glimpse of a future where he could fix everything. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control of his own destiny. He had always believed that time was something that could be studied, understood, and controlled with enough effort and knowledge. But now, after everything he had learned, Max was starting to believe that time was a force far beyond anything he could comprehend. It was more than just a line to be manipulated. It was an entity in itself, one that could fight back, that could punish those who dared to change it. Max ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He had already tampered with time once, during his initial experiment with the chronosphere. That had been a mistake. He hadn't understood the risks, hadn't realized the consequences of what he was doing. But now, armed with the knowledge of what might happen, was he any better prepared to make a decision? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't stay here, trapped in this cycle of doubt. He needed answers. He needed to know if there was anyone else who had been through this, who had faced the same dilemma. Max had the feeling that the man who had warned him, who had appeared out of nowhere with knowledge of his work, wasn't the only one who knew about the dangers of time travel. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and headed out of the workshop, his footsteps quick and determined. He didn't know where he was going, but the pull of the unknown drove him forward. He had to find someone who could explain what he was dealing with, someone who had been there before, someone who understood the true cost of altering time. Max didn't know how long he wandered, lost in thought, until he found himself standing in front of a small, nondescript building in the middle of a quiet street. He had no idea why he had come here, why this place had drawn him in, but something about it felt important. The building was old, with weathered bricks and a faded sign hanging above the door. It wasn't much to look at, but it was enough to make Max's heart race. He walked up to the door, his hand hovering over the handle for a moment before he pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of old bookshelves lining the walls. The air smelled musty, like the pages of forgotten stories. In the far corner, a man sat at a desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and books. His hair was graying, his glasses perched low on his nose, and he looked up as Max entered. The man didn't say anything at first, just studied Max with a look that seemed to pierce through him. as if he already knew why Max was here. "I'm looking for answers," Max said, his voice steady but uncertain. "About time travel. About the chronosphere." The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't react immediately. He set his pen down and motioned for Max to sit across from him. "You've come to the right place. I assume you know what you're dealing with." Max sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. "I think I understand the basics, but I'm not sure if I understand the consequences. I've been told there are others who've used it before, people who've made mistakes. What happens if I keep using the chronosphere? What happens if I keep changing things?" The man regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "I'm going to tell you something that you might not want to hear, but you need to understand it. Time travel is not a game. It's not a toy. It's not something to be taken lightly." Max leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean? What are the consequences?" The man sighed deeply, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "The consequences are far-reaching. Every time you alter the past, you don't just change a single event. You affect the fabric of time itself. You create ripples that spread through history, altering not just your own timeline, but countless others. Every change has a cost, a price that's paid in ways you can't begin to imagine." Max felt a shiver run down his spine. "What kind of cost?" The man's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "The kind of cost that can destroy lives. The kind of cost that can erase people from existence. Every time you change something in the past, you risk breaking the delicate balance that holds everything together. And once that balance is broken, there's no going back." Max's mind raced. This wasn't just about his parents. This wasn't just about fixing his own mistakes. This was about something far bigger, something far more dangerous than he had ever realized. "So, what do I do?" Max asked, his voice trembling. "How do I stop?" The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "You don't. Once you start meddling with time, you can't undo what you've done. The best you can do is try to control it. But even that is no guarantee. There are forces that watch over these things. Forces that will come for you if you disrupt too much." Max's breath caught in his throat. "Forces?" The man nodded. "There are people who've been doing this for centuries, watching over the timeline, making sure no one goes too far. They are the ones who clean up the mess when things go wrong. And trust me, things will go wrong. Sooner or later, you'll attract their attention." Max's mind was spinning. He had thought he was the one in control. He had believed that the chronosphere was his to use, his to understand. But now he was beginning to realize just how small he was in the grand scheme of things. "There's no way out, is there?" Max asked quietly, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. The man shook his head. "Not unless you want to disappear completely. But if you keep going down this path, you won't have any choice." Max stood up, his knees weak, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he could stop now. The chronosphere had given him a glimpse of something more, something beyond the limitations of time. But at what cost? The man's voice followed him as he walked toward the door. "Remember, Max, time doesn't forgive, and neither do those who guard it." Max's mind spun as he left the small, dimly lit building. The man's words echoed in his thoughts like a constant reminder of the path he had chosen. Time doesn't forgive. He could hear it over and over, drowning out everything else. It was as if he had been warned, and yet he was already too far gone to turn back. He didn't know where he was going. His feet seemed to carry him through the quiet streets, lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts. It was late, the streets nearly empty, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. He was aware of the weight of the chronosphere, the power it held, pressing against him with each step he took. As he walked, he found himself wondering just how much time he had left before he would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The forces the man had mentioned, were they real? Had they been watching him from the beginning? He had always thought of time as something malleable, something that could be bent and shaped to fit his desires. But now he wasn't so sure. The question that plagued him now wasn't whether he could change the past. It was whether he should. What if his obsession with saving his parents was a lie, a false belief that time could be rewritten, a mistake that would unravel everything? What if the true cost of changing the past wasn't just the death of those who had lived through it, but the destruction of everything that came after? Max didn't know how much time had passed when he found himself standing in front of his workshop again. The building loomed before him, silent and still, as though it too were waiting for something. For a moment, he stood there, staring at it, unsure of what to do next. He could feel the pull of the chronosphere calling to him, the temptation to use it again almost unbearable. But the man's words had been clear. He had said that there was no going back, that time would not forgive him. And yet, Max couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a chance, that he could still fix everything if he just tried harder. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the workshop. The familiar hum of the chronosphere greeted him as he stepped inside. The machine sat in the center of the room, its sleek surface gleaming in the dim light. It looked so harmless, so simple. But Max knew better now. It wasn't just a machine. It was a key to a world he didn't fully understand, a world that could destroy him if he wasn't careful. Max walked over to the chronosphere, his hands trembling as he placed them on the cool surface. His heart raced in his chest. He could feel the power pulsing beneath his fingers, calling to him, offering him the chance to rewrite his own history. But as he stared at the machine, a wave of doubt washed over him. He closed his eyes, remembering the man's warning. What would happen if he made the wrong choice? What would happen if he changed the past too much? He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to believe that he could make a difference, that he could save his parents, stop the accident. But a part of him knew that it was more than that. His desire to change the past had grown into something bigger, something more dangerous. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about control. It was about having the power to shape his own destiny, to make the world bend to his will. Max shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in his mind. He couldn't do this. He couldn't keep chasing an illusion. He had already seen the consequences of his actions. He had already felt the ripple effects of his changes. But what if there was a way to control it? What if he could use the chronosphere but use it wisely? What if he could navigate the dangers, avoid the mistakes others had made, and find a way to change things without destroying everything? The thoughts battled in his mind, the weight of the decision nearly crushing him. He could feel the pull of the machine, its call growing stronger with each passing second. And yet, deep down, Max knew that there was a line, an invisible line that he could not cross. Once he crossed it, there would be no coming back. His fingers hovered over the controls. He could press the button. He could go back. He could try again. He could save them. But then he remembered Claire's face, the worry in her eyes, the concern in her voice. He remembered the man's warning, the fear in his words. And suddenly, Max wasn't sure if he was in control of this anymore. Maybe it wasn't just about fixing his own past. Maybe there was something greater at stake. Max stepped away from the machine, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He couldn't do this. Not today. Not yet. He turned and walked out of the workshop, leaving the chronosphere behind. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to move forward without rewriting the past. Maybe there was a way to let go. But even as he walked away, the feeling lingered, like a shadow following him in the darkness. He knew that the temptation would return. It always did. And when it did, he wasn't sure if he would be strong enough to resist. Max spent the following days in a haze, his mind caught between the quiet decision he had made to step away from the chronosphere and the storm that still raged inside him. It was as if a part of him had been left behind in the workshop, with the machine calling to him, waiting for the moment when he would return to it. But for now, he resisted. He focused on the mundane tasks of everyday life, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. He spent time with Claire, who was relieved but still worried. She could tell that he was different, that something had changed in him since his visit to the small building. But she didn't press him to talk about it. She knew he had to work through it in his own way. Despite his efforts to push the machine out of his mind, It lingered in the background, like a constant hum that he could never quite escape. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the glint of its surface, hear its mechanical pulse in the back of his thoughts. It was almost as if the machine had become a part of him, its power running through his veins, tempting him to take control of time once more. One afternoon, as Max sat in his favorite coffee shop, trying to read a book to distract himself, he overheard a conversation at the table next to him. Two men were talking in hushed tones, their voices low and urgent. Max wasn't normally one to eavesdrop, but something about their conversation caught his attention. The chronosphere, one of them was saying, it's not just about changing the past. It's about creating new timelines, new realities. People don't realize that every time they use it, they're opening doors to worlds that never existed. Max froze, his hand gripping the edge of his coffee cup so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart began to race, his breath quickening. He hadn't imagined it. These men, whoever they were, knew about the chronosphere. They knew about the very machine he had built, and what's more, they were talking about it as though they had used it themselves. The other man leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. We have to be careful. If the wrong person finds out about this, if they understand how to harness its power, it could be disastrous. You can't just create new timelines and expect everything to work out. Max's pulse quickened. New timelines? He had known that time travel was dangerous, but the idea that the chronosphere could create entirely new realities was something he had never considered. He had been so focused on altering his own past that he hadn't thought about the implications of what his invention could truly do. Was it even possible to create new timelines, or had he been blind to the deeper potential of the machine? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he tried to distance himself from the conversation. But his mind was already spinning, racing with possibilities. Who were these men? What did they know about the chronosphere? And more importantly, what did they mean by new timelines? Could the machine truly create alternate realities? As Max walked out of the coffee shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire understanding of time and his invention had just shifted. He had thought that time travel was something linear, something that could be bent and manipulated, but the idea of new timelines, of branching realities, was something completely different. It wasn't just about changing the past. It was about creating new versions of the future, new paths that could spiral off in countless directions. Max's mind raced as he walked back to his workshop, his thoughts consumed by what he had just overheard. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of what the chronosphere could do. If there were others who knew how to use it, others who had been experimenting with its power, then what else could they be capable of? When he arrived at the workshop, he hesitated at the door. The machine sat in the center of the room, silent and still, waiting for him. Max stood there for a long time, staring at it. The temptation to step forward, to use it once more, was almost overwhelming. But now, with the new information swirling in his head, he knew that he had to be cautious. He didn't understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. He hadn't realized that the chronosphere could create entirely new timelines, new realities. But was that what he wanted? To create alternate realities? Could he control something like that? The power to change history was already dangerous enough. Could it be even more dangerous to have the ability to shape new worlds? Max shook his head, trying to push the thought out of his mind. He couldn't get distracted. He had to focus. There were forces at work here that he didn't understand, and if he wasn't careful, he could lose himself in a game that he couldn't win. He sat down at his workbench, trying to organize his thoughts. What was he supposed to do now? How could he even begin to understand the full potential of the chronosphere? It wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about something much bigger, much more dangerous than he had ever realized. Max closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had to figure this out. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The stakes were too high, and yet, the nagging question remained in the back of his mind. Could he truly walk away from the chronosphere? Could he resist the temptation to use it again, to control the past and the future? Or had he already crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed? As the days went by, Max found himself consumed by these questions, unable to focus on anything else. He knew that he couldn't go on like this forever. Eventually, he would have to make a decision. But what would that decision be? Max's life had become a balancing act between his obsession with the chronosphere and the growing realization of its consequences. He couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried to focus on anything else, the implications of what he had created, and what he could do with it, haunted him. The overheard conversation in the coffee shop about new timelines had been the tipping point. It had opened his eyes to a whole new level of danger, one he hadn't fully understood before. But now, sitting in the workshop, Max had come to a difficult conclusion. He had to know more. He couldn't keep living in fear of what the chronosphere could do without understanding it fully. He had to take the next step. He had to experiment further. But this time, he would be prepared. He couldn't afford to make the same mistakes again. Max turned his gaze toward the chronosphere. It sat there, silent and still, like an ancient artifact waiting to be discovered. Its hum had faded, but he could still feel the energy it radiated, pulsing beneath the surface. The idea of creating new timelines, the idea of shaping alternate realities was both exhilarating and terrifying. But Max wasn't sure if he could resist the temptation anymore. He had already seen what it was capable of, but the question still nagged at him. What if he could control it? What if he could use it responsibly to fix not just his own mistakes, but the mistakes of others? What if he could prevent disasters, avert wars, save lives, without causing the unraveling of time itself? The thought was intoxicating. Max could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, urging him to act. But deep down, he knew the risks. He had learned the hard way that time travel was unpredictable. It didn't just alter events, it created ripples, changes that affected everything in their wake. Even the smallest shift could create chaos in ways that no one could anticipate. And yet, the idea of not trying, of letting things stay the way they were, felt equally unbearable. Max's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the door to the workshop opening. He turned to find Claire standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She had been silent about his obsession with the chronosphere for days now, but he could see in her eyes that she knew he was getting closer to the edge. "I'm not going to let you do this," Claire said firmly, her voice steady. "I won't let you risk everything again." Max stared at her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had known that this moment would come. He had known that Claire wouldn't just stand by and watch him descend further into this obsession. She had always been the one to ground him, to remind him of what was truly important. But right now, all Max could see was the machine, the power, the possibility, the choice. "I have to try." "Claire," Max said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. "I can't just let this go. I need to understand it. I need to know if I can fix everything." Claire's face softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Fix everything? Max, you can't just keep going back. You're not a god. You're not supposed to control time." "I'm not trying to control time," Max replied, his voice growing more agitated. "I'm trying to make things right. My parents, they're gone and I can't accept that. I have the chance to change things, to fix the past. I can save them. I can fix everything, Claire." Claire stepped forward, reaching out to him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "And what happens when you fix one thing, but it breaks something else? What happens when you change the past and it spirals out of control? What happens when you lose yourself in all of it?" Max's heart sank as he realized that, despite his determination, Claire was right. He had already felt the consequences of his actions. He had already seen what happened when the past was tampered with. The temptation to use the chronosphere, to fix the things he couldn't bear to leave broken, was powerful. But it wasn't worth it. Not anymore. He took a step back from the chronosphere, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I don't know what to do anymore," Max admitted quietly. "I don't know how to fix it. How do you let go of something like this?" Claire's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to fix everything, Max. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let things be. To live with the mistakes, the pain, and move forward. Time doesn't need to be controlled. It just needs to be understood." Max swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to believe her, He wanted to believe that he could find peace without the chronosphere, that he could live his life without trying to rewrite the past. But it was hard to let go of something that had become such an integral part of his existence. "I'm afraid," Max confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Afraid that I'll lose everything. Afraid that the past will never stop haunting me." Claire took his hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. "I'm here with you, Max. You don't have to do this alone. You've already lost so much, but you're not going to lose yourself in this. You can still have a future. You can still have a life without trying to change what's already been done." Max closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe the real mistake had been believing that he could control time, that he could shape the past to his will. Maybe the true power wasn't in changing history, it was in accepting it, in moving forward and making peace with the things he couldn't change. As he opened his eyes and looked at Claire, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from trying to fix everything, from trying to control time. It was the kind of hope that came from acceptance, from understanding that life wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about living in the present with all its imperfections. Max took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I'm going to try," he said softly. "I'm going to try and let it go. For real this time." Claire smiled gently, a mix of relief and pride in her eyes. "I know you can." As Max turned away from the chronosphere, leaving it behind in the workshop, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a decision that would make everything better overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, he could find peace in the present without needing to change the past. The weeks that followed were a time of transition for Max. The decision to leave the chronosphere behind had not been an easy one, and at times the temptation to return to it, just one more try, one more attempt to fix the past, crept into his thoughts like a whispering shadow. But as the days went on, Max found himself slowly, painfully, moving forward. He had chosen to focus on the present, on the life he had now, and on the relationships he had left. He couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wanted to. The best he could do was embrace the future that was still unwritten. Claire's support meant everything to him during this time. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing, taking long walks in the park, and rediscovering the simple joys of life. Max had realized that, in his obsession with changing the past, he had forgotten what really mattered. The people he loved, the moments that made life worth living. One evening, as they sat on a bench in a quiet corner of the park, Claire turned to him, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. "Max," she began, her voice tentative, as if she were unsure of how to broach the subject. "Do you ever think about the future? What you want, outside of all this?" Max glanced at her, surprised by the question. He had spent so much time fixating on the past that the future had almost become an afterthought. But now, sitting here with Claire, he realized how much he had neglected to consider what came next. "I don't know," he admitted, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "I guess I've been so focused on trying to fix what's already happened that I've forgotten to think about what's still ahead of me. I'm not sure what I want anymore." Claire smiled softly, a gentle understanding in her gaze. "It's okay. I think you've been through so much trying to fix the past that it's hard to imagine a future. Maybe it just needs to be lived." For the first time in months, Max felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about undoing the past. It was about embracing the unknown, stepping into the future with all its uncertainties and imperfections. It wasn't about trying to control time, it was about living with it. The next few days were a blur of small but significant moments. Max worked on his projects, focusing on new innovations in technology and engineering that didn't involve time travel, but instead aimed to make life better in more practical ways. He had even begun to volunteer at a local community center, helping kids with science projects and fostering a new generation of curious minds. For the first time, Max felt like he was making a difference, not by changing the past, but by building something for the future. But as life moved forward, Max still felt a gnawing curiosity about what had happened to the men he had overheard at the coffee shop. They had mentioned the chronosphere, the potential for creating alternate timelines, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something larger. A network of people who understood the true power of time travel. Despite his decision to walk away from the chronosphere, a part of him still wondered what other secrets were out there, hidden in the depths of the machine's potential. Were there others like him, tinkering with time in secret? What had become of the people who had learned to create new timelines? Max didn't know if he would ever find answers to those questions. Part of him was content to leave the past behind, to accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. But another part of him, a quieter, more inquisitive part, couldn't help but feel drawn to the unknown. The power of the chronosphere still lingered in his mind, like a half-remembered dream. One night, as he sat alone in the workshop, Max found himself staring at the empty space where the chronosphere had once stood. His fingers brushed the worn edges of his workbench, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange pull, an urge to learn more, to understand the full scope of the chronosphere's power. But he hesitated. The decision he had made to walk away still felt right, even if the questions remained unanswered. Max took a deep breath and stood up, walking away from the workbench. He knew that he couldn't let himself be consumed by the need to understand everything. Some things were better left unknown. As he left the workshop and headed back to his apartment, Max couldn't help but feel that the future, though uncertain, held more promise than he had ever realized. The chronosphere, with all its power, would always be a part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He was more than the mistakes of his past, more than the machine he had built. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. The future, as Claire had said, wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something new, something that could not be undone, something that belonged to him, to Claire, and to the world they would build together. And for the first time, Max felt ready to face it. Max woke up the next morning with a strange sense of peace. The decision to step away from the chronosphere had given him a newfound clarity, a feeling of release. He had let go of the past in a way he never thought possible. But as the days passed, a quiet undercurrent of doubt began to stir within him. The world was moving forward, and yet, he couldn't entirely shake the feeling that there was more to his story, more to the chronosphere, that he had yet to uncover. But for the time being, he pushed those thoughts aside. He had other priorities now. He had begun teaching at a local college, sharing his knowledge of technology and engineering with students who were eager to learn. It felt good to be on the other side of the classroom, helping to shape the next generation of innovators. It was a new path, one that allowed him to focus on the present and the future, rather than the haunting shadows of his past. Still, the feeling lingered. Max had always been driven by a need to understand, to unlock the mysteries of the universe. The chronosphere had been his greatest creation, but also his greatest burden. He had stepped away from it, but the echoes of time still called to him in quiet moments, like a whisper in the dark. One evening, as Max sat in his apartment, reflecting on the work he had done at the community center earlier that day, he received an unexpected phone call. The number on his screen was unfamiliar, and he hesitated before answering. "Max?" a voice asked when he picked up. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but there was something about it that sounded familiar. "Max Carter, right?" "Yes, this is Max," he replied cautiously. "Who's calling?" "My name is Elias. Elias Weber. I think you've been looking for answers." Max's heart skipped a beat. The name meant nothing to him, but the words hit him with the force of a revelation. Looking for answers? What did that mean? "I'm not sure what you mean," Max said slowly, trying to mask the sudden tension in his voice. "I know what you've been working on," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "And I know that you haven't let it go. You can't hide from it forever. It's in your blood now, Max. You've seen what the chronosphere can do. You know what it's capable of. And you know that there are others out there just like you. People who understand how to harness its power." Max felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was exactly what he had feared, the idea that there were others who knew about the chronosphere, others who understood its potential and perhaps its dangers. He had been trying to leave that part of his life behind, but now it was clear that the past wasn't finished with him yet. "How do you know about the chronosphere?" Max demanded, his voice tight with apprehension. Elias was quiet for a moment, as if considering his response. "Because I've seen it. I've used it. And I've seen the consequences of tampering with time. I know what you're capable of, Max. And I know you're not done yet." Max's mind raced. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. The moment he had both dreaded and anticipated. He had thought he could walk away, but now it seemed like the past was determined to find him. "I don't want any part of it," Max said firmly, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "I've made my choice. I'm done with time travel. I've seen enough." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Elias spoke again, his voice was different. More urgent, more insistent. "You think you're done? You think you can just walk away from this? The chronosphere isn't something you can abandon, Max. It's not something you can forget. You've seen the power it holds. And you've felt the pull of time, haven't you? I know you have. You can't pretend it isn't there." Max gritted his teeth, trying to keep his emotions in check. Elias was right in some ways. He had felt the pull of the machine, the temptation to control time, to rewrite history. It was powerful, too powerful to ignore. But that didn't mean he had to give in. "I'm not getting involved again," Max said, his voice firm. "If you know what's best for you, you'll stay away from me. You don't know what you're dealing with." There was a soft laugh on the other end of the line, and Max felt a wave of frustration. This person, this Elias Weber, was playing a dangerous game. He was toying with forces that could easily spiral out of control. And yet, Max couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this conversation than he understood. "You don't get it, Max," Elias said, his tone shifting again, this time softer, more persuasive. "The chronosphere is part of something much larger, something bigger than just you or me. There's a reason you built it, a reason it exists. And there are people out there. People who know exactly what it can do, people who understand its true potential. You can't hide from this forever. You have a choice to make." Max's mind spun. The weight of Elias' words settled over him like a blanket, smothering his thoughts. He had created the chronosphere, yes, but had it been by accident? Or was there some deeper reason for its existence? Was there something he had missed? Something more significant than he had ever realized? "I don't need to make any more choices," Max said, his voice tight. "I've already made my decision. I'm done." But even as the words left his mouth, Max wasn't sure he believed them. Elias sighed on the other end of the line. "You'll come around, Max. You always do. I'll be waiting." The line went dead. Max stared at the phone in his hand, the words of the mysterious Elias Weber echoing in his mind. What had he just gotten himself into? Had he really walked away from the chronosphere? Or was he simply fooling himself? And who was Elias? What did he know that Max didn't? There was one thing Max was sure of: his past was never truly gone. The chronosphere, the mysteries it held, the forces he couldn't control, it was all still out there. And sooner or later, he would have to face it again. Max couldn't sleep that night. The phone call from Elias Weber had stirred something deep inside him, a mixture of fear and fascination. For all his resolve to leave the chronosphere behind, to move forward with his life, something in Elias's words had reignited the spark of curiosity that had originally driven him to build the machine. It had always been about discovery, about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But now, there was a darker edge to that curiosity, a temptation that he knew he couldn't ignore. Elias had been right about one thing. Max couldn't pretend that the chronosphere wasn't still a part of him. No matter how much he tried to distance himself from it, no matter how many new projects he took on, it lingered in the back of his mind. Time had always been his obsession, and the machine had been the key to unlocking it. The idea that there were others out there who understood it, who knew what it was truly capable of, left Max with a gnawing sense of unease. But what exactly did Elias mean by something bigger? What was the chronosphere really connected to? Max's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. Was there a larger organization behind the time manipulation he had stumbled upon? Were there others like him using the chronosphere for their own purposes? Max couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. There was so much he didn't understand, so much he hadn't considered. He had been so focused on trying to undo his past mistakes that he hadn't looked at the bigger picture. But now Elias had planted a seed of doubt, one that he couldn't ignore. Max stared at the clock on the wall. The hours were slipping away, but his mind wouldn't quiet. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to fix things. But now, the questions swirling in his mind seemed too vast, too complex to answer on his own. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from Claire. "Everything okay?" The message read. Max sighed, his fingers hovering over the keys as he considered how to respond. Should he tell her about the call from Elias? Should he explain the unease he felt, the curiosity that was beginning to take root again? He didn't want to drag her into this mess. Not after everything they had been through. But the truth was, he didn't know who else to turn to. Claire had always been his anchor, the one person who kept him grounded, even when the world around him felt like it was falling apart. He typed a quick reply. "I'm fine, just thinking about some things. Don't worry." Max didn't expect her to respond immediately, but within seconds, the phone buzzed again. Another message from Claire. "I'm here if you need to talk, Max. Always." Max felt a pang of guilt. Claire deserved so much more than the turmoil he was experiencing. She had supported him through the darkest moments of his life, and now here he was, caught in the web of his own creation once again. He couldn't let her down, but the temptation to dig deeper into the mysteries surrounding the chronosphere was almost overwhelming. Every instinct in him screamed that there was more to discover, more to learn, more to control. Max could feel the pull, the inexorable force drawing him back to the workshop, to the machine that had once consumed his every thought. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. The screen displayed an unknown number. Max hesitated before answering. Could be Elias again. Or worse, it could be someone else who knew about the chronosphere, someone who wanted to use it for their own purposes. "Hello," Max said, his voice cautious. "Max Carter." The voice on the other end was smooth, measured. "I've been waiting for you to call." Max's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't Elias. This voice was different, but there was something eerily familiar about it. "Who is this?" Max demanded. "What do you want?" The voice chuckled softly. "I'm someone who knows what you've been working on. I know about the chronosphere, Max. And I know that you haven't really let it go. You've been thinking about it, haven't you? You've been wondering what else you could do with it." Max felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. How did this person know? Had Elias told them? Or was this someone else? Someone with an even greater understanding of the machine's power? "I'm not interested in continuing this," Max said, his voice firm. "I'm done with the chronosphere." The voice on the other end sighed. "You can't hide from it forever, Max. You're too curious. You're too driven. You built something incredible and now you're going to let it go? You can't. Not when there's so much more you can do. So much more you can understand. And we can help you." Max's mind reeled. "Who is we? What do you want from me?" "There are others, Max." The voice continued, its tone colder now. "People who understand the chronosphere better than anyone else. We've been watching you. We know what you're capable of. We've been waiting for you to come to us." Max's blood ran cold. The words "we've been watching you" echoed in his mind. A sinister reminder of how deeply the web surrounding the chronosphere had entangled him. There were people who knew everything about him, about his creation. And they weren't interested in letting him go. They wanted him to join them, to use his knowledge and skills for their own purposes. Max felt a wave of panic rise within him, but he refused to show weakness. He had to maintain control. He had to stand his ground. "I don't want any part of this," Max said, his voice steady despite the rising fear inside him. "Whoever you are, stay away from me." The voice didn't respond immediately. When it did, there was a hint of amusement in the tone. "We'll see about that, Max," the voice said. "You can't escape your destiny. Not when you've already seen what the chronosphere can do. The call ended abruptly, and Max was left standing in the silence of his apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? What had he created? And what would happen next? The morning after the unsettling phone call, Max was a mess. He couldn't focus on anything. His thoughts were consumed with the ominous conversation from the night before. Someone had been watching him, tracking his every move. This wasn't just a random call. It felt calculated, like a warning. And the most chilling part was that they weren't the first to reach out to him. Elias Weber had also seemed to know something about the chronosphere, about Max's involvement with time travel, and that alone was enough to make his skin crawl. Max's mind raced as he paced around his apartment, his thoughts spiraling. He had to find out who these people were, what they wanted, and how they knew about the chronosphere. He couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Claire. "Max, where are you? You're not answering your phone. I'm worried." Max felt a pang of guilt as he read her message. Claire had always been there for him, and now he was shutting her out. He couldn't keep doing this, keeping her in the dark about everything. She deserved to know the truth. But what could he tell her? How much could he reveal without dragging her into the chaos that was swirling around him? He quickly typed a response. "I'm sorry. I'm just dealing with some stuff. I'll call you later." He knew that wasn't enough, that he couldn't keep hiding from her. But for now, he needed to figure out what to do next. He couldn't keep running away from the truth. He had to confront it head-on. Max knew that to truly move forward, he would need answers. And the only way to get those answers was to find the people who were behind these cryptic calls. But where to start? Who could he trust? Was Elias really trying to help him? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle, leading him deeper into a web of secrets? Max's mind kept circling back to the same conclusion. He had no choice but to go back to where it all started. He had to return to the workshop, to the chronosphere. It was the only place that held the answers, the only place where he might find a way to make sense of all of this. The thought made his heart race. The chronosphere had consumed him once before. It had driven him to the brink of madness, and he knew that it could easily do so again. But he had no other option. He had to know what he had missed, what was still hidden beneath the surface. He grabbed his jacket and walked out of his apartment, his resolve hardening with each step. The journey ahead would be dangerous, he knew that. But he couldn't turn back now. The air outside was crisp, the sky overcast with dark clouds. Max didn't care about the weather. He had a mission and nothing else mattered. As he walked to the workshop, he tried to keep his thoughts focused. He had to be careful, he reminded himself. There were people out there who wanted the chronosphere, and they would stop at nothing to get it. He had no idea how deep this conspiracy went, but he had to find out. When he arrived at the workshop, the familiar hum of machines and the smell of metal filled the air. The place was exactly as he had left it. Silent, still, as though frozen in time. Max felt a pang of nostalgia as he stepped inside. It had been months since he had last worked here, months since he had touched the chronosphere. The memories of his obsession with the machine, the long nights spent experimenting, the endless hours trying to perfect his creation, all came rushing back. Max hesitated at the doorway, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't just dive in blindly. He needed a plan, a way to approach this carefully. He knew that the chronosphere wasn't something to be tampered with lightly. But he had no other choice. He stepped forward and approached the workbench. The chronosphere was still there, hidden beneath a cloth, waiting. It almost felt like the machine was calling to him, beckoning him to come closer, to unlock its secrets once again. Max took a deep breath and pulled back the cloth. There it was, the chronosphere sitting quietly in front of him. The intricate network of wires, the sleek metallic surface. It looked so innocent, so simple. But Max knew better. This was no ordinary machine. This was the key to time itself, the instrument that had the potential to alter the course of history. As he stared at it, Max felt a sense of foreboding wash over him. The questions were multiplying in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. Was this the answer to everything? Or was it the beginning of something much worse? He couldn't answer that yet. But he knew one thing for sure: he had to find out. Max's fingers brushed against the cold surface of the chronosphere, and he felt a jolt of electricity shoot through him. The machine was alive in a way that he hadn't expected. It seemed to hum with power, as though it were waiting for him to take the next step. He swallowed hard, steeling himself for what was to come. He had already paid the price for meddling with time, but now it seemed like there was no turning back. The past, the present, and the future, they were all intertwined, and he had to find the thread that would unravel it all. Max stood frozen before the chronosphere, feeling the weight of its potential bear down on him. His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore the call to action. It was as if the machine itself were speaking to him, beckoning him to understand its mysteries. But with each passing second, the dread grew heavier. He had experienced the consequences of tampering with time firsthand, and those memories haunted him. He had seen the fractures in reality, the subtle yet terrifying ripples that formed whenever time was altered. No matter how much he had tried to distance himself from it, time travel had a way of pulling him back, as though it were a force he could never fully escape. Max closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, trying to center himself. He could feel the pull of the chronosphere, almost like a magnetic force, compelling him to reach out. But what would happen if he did? What was waiting for him in this realm of time manipulation? And more importantly, what would happen if he succeeded or failed? The quiet hum of the machine filled the workshop, and Max stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers brushed against the cool surface of the chronosphere, the world around him seemed to shift. It was as if the air grew denser, the very fabric of time beginning to ripple. He felt a slight disorientation, a strange sensation of being both here and somewhere else. The hum of the machine grew louder, and for a moment, Max thought he could hear whispers, distant voices, as though time itself were speaking to him. But then, just as suddenly as the feeling had come, it was gone. Max recoiled, his heart racing. He stepped back from the machine, breathing heavily, trying to regain his bearings. Had he just experienced a time lapse? A brief window into another reality? Or had the machine simply triggered something in his mind? Whatever it was, it had felt real, far too real. Max clenched his fists, trying to shake off the unease. He couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. He had to know what the chronosphere was capable of, what secrets it held. He couldn't keep running away from this. Taking a deep breath, Max decided to proceed cautiously. He walked to the console and powered on the machine, his fingers hesitating just above the controls. He knew that activating the chronosphere could send him to places he might never be able to return from. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everything, the forces that had been set in motion when he built this machine. There were people out there, people who knew far too much, and Max had to understand what they wanted, what they planned to do with the power of time. As the chronosphere powered up, a low rumble filled the room, and the lights flickered overhead. Max adjusted the settings, his heart pounding faster as the machine came to life. He couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the device, its intricate design, its elegance. It was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a dangerous tool. And in the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic. He pressed a button, and the room seemed to warp. For a brief moment, the world around him appeared to stretch and twist, as if the very laws of physics were being rewritten. Max's stomach lurched as he felt his body pulled in multiple directions, caught in a vortex of shifting time and space. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus on the controls. He couldn't lose control now. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. Max found himself standing in the workshop again, the machine humming softly before him. His mind was racing, and his heart was still pounding in his chest. But he hadn't traveled anywhere. Nothing had changed. It was as if the machine had shown him only a glimpse, a fleeting window into what it could do. Max's hands trembled as he reached for the chronosphere's interface again. He had felt something that had gone beyond mere science. It was as though the machine had opened a doorway to the unknown, to the very fabric of time itself. And yet, it was clear that he had only scratched the surface. There was so much more to uncover, but was he ready to face it? A sudden thought pierced through his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Was Elias behind this? Was this exactly what he wanted? To tempt Max back into the world of time travel, to draw him in deeper so that he could use the machine for his own ends? Max clenched his jaw, determination flaring in his chest. He wouldn't let anyone, Elias, the mysterious callers, or anyone else, control the chronosphere. It was his creation, and if anyone was going to uncover its secrets, it would be him. But this time he had to do it on his own terms. Just then, Max's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, expecting another cryptic message or call. But this time it was something different, something that made his blood run cold. A new message from an unknown number. "We know what you've done. You're not alone anymore. The time has come." Max's hands shook as he read the words. The text seemed to mock him, reminding him that there were others, people who were keeping a close watch on him, waiting for him to make his next move. This wasn't just about one person anymore. There was an organization, a collective force working behind the scenes, and Max had no idea how far their reach extended. He stared at the message for a long moment, feeling trapped between two worlds, the world of the present and the world of time, where everything was uncertain. He had built the chronosphere with the hope of understanding time, of controlling it. But now it seemed that time had become something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Max set the phone down slowly, taking a deep breath. He knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't turn back. The time had come, and there was no more running from the truth. The chronosphere had unlocked a door that he couldn't close, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Max stood motionless in the workshop, staring at the cryptic message on his phone. "We know what you've done. You're not alone anymore. The time has come." The words seemed to pulse with a dark energy, like a warning that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Whoever was behind this knew everything about him, about the chronosphere, and about the choices he had made. He pocketed his phone and turned back toward the machine. The hum of the chronosphere filled the room, a constant, almost comforting sound. It was as if it were calling to him, urging him to take that final step into the unknown. Max had always felt a strange connection to the machine, as though it were a part of him, a reflection of his own obsession with time. But now, that connection felt more like a chain, binding him to a fate he wasn't sure he wanted. But he couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear. He had spent years working on the chronosphere, crafting it with his own hands, and now it was time to face the consequences. He had never expected anything like this, never imagined that his creation would attract the attention of others. People who were willing to go to any lengths to control time for their own purposes. Max's mind raced. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they waited until now to make their move? He had to find out, and the only way to do that was to confront them head-on. There was no more running from the truth. As he stepped closer to the chronosphere, Max's thoughts drifted back to Elias. The strange conversation they had shared weeks ago echoed in his mind. Elias had seemed to know something, had hinted at a larger network, a group of people who had been watching him. Max had dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to paranoia. But now, everything was falling into place. Elias had been warning him about the people who had been tracking his every move. Max placed his hand on the smooth surface of the machine, feeling the familiar tingle of electricity that always accompanied contact. He could feel its power coursing through his veins, but this time, it didn't feel as reassuring. This time, the machine felt dangerous, unpredictable. He took a deep breath and powered it up once again. The machine whirred to life, its lights flickering as the interface came online. Max hesitated, his finger hovering over the controls. He had to decide. This wasn't just about exploring time anymore. This was about survival. This was about protecting the chronosphere from falling into the wrong hands. Max's hand trembled as he typed in a series of commands. The screen displayed a map of timelines, a web of possibilities stretching out before him. Each thread represented a different version of reality, a different path that time could take. Some were faint and barely visible, Others pulsed with intensity, as though they were moments of critical importance. He felt a strange pull toward one of the threads. It was brighter than the rest, its energy drawing him in. Max focused on it, and as he did, he could almost hear a faint voice, whispering from the depths of time itself. "Don't," the voice seemed to say. "You're not ready." Max's breath caught in his throat, but he couldn't pull away. The thread called to him, and he felt an overwhelming urge to follow it. There was something there, something he needed to understand, something that could change everything. His finger moved without thinking, selecting the thread. The machine responded immediately, its lights flashing faster as the chronosphere began to spin. The air in the room thickened, and the walls seemed to stretch and warp. Max felt a familiar sense of disorientation, the same sensation he had experienced during his earlier experiments. But this time it was different. This time the pull of time was stronger, more insistent. Suddenly everything went black. Max felt weightless, as though he were floating in a void. The familiar hum of the machine was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. He had no idea where or when he was. The darkness around him seemed infinite, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, if he had gone too far. But then, a light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, just a flicker on the horizon. But it grew brighter, drawing closer. Max felt a surge of hope. Perhaps he had found the answers he was looking for. As the light grew stronger, he began to make out shapes, figures standing in the distance. There were people, but they were not like anyone Max had ever seen. They were shadowy, indistinct, as though they were part of the fabric of time itself. They seemed to shimmer, their outlines constantly shifting, like reflections on a surface of water. Max took a step forward, his curiosity overriding his fear. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know what this was all leading to. "Welcome, Max," a voice said, soft yet unmistakable. Max froze. He recognized the voice. It was Elias. "You've come a long way," Elias continued, his voice echoing in the void. "But you still don't understand, do you? You're not the only one who can manipulate time. There are others, and they've been watching you." Max's heart raced. "What is this place? What are you talking about?" Elias's laughter echoed around him. "You're standing at the threshold, Max. The threshold of everything. Time isn't just a linear construct. It's a web, a network of infinite possibilities, and we, those who understand it, are the ones who weave it. You've only scratched the surface of what's possible. The chronosphere was never just about you. It's a tool, and now it's time for you to choose how it will be used." Max shook his head, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. This was too much. Too many questions, too many contradictions. How could Elias know all of this? And what did he mean by weaving time? Was there a larger organization out there, controlling the threads of reality? Or was this some kind of hallucination, a manifestation of his own fears and doubts? "You're not alone anymore," Elias said again, his voice colder this time. "The time has come, Max, and now you must decide. Will you join us, or will you try to resist?" Max felt the weight of those words settle on him like a heavy cloak. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to control his destiny. But now it seemed like that choice was being taken from him. There were forces at work that he couldn't even begin to understand. And whether he liked it or not, he was part of their game now. The light around him grew brighter, and the shadowy figures seemed to converge on him. Max's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no going back now. The future was uncertain, and time was no longer something he could control. It was a force far greater than anything he had ever imagined. And now, Max Carter had to choose which side of time he would stand on. The world in 3025 was eerily silent. Gone were the days of bustling cities, the roar of engines, and the chatter of people in crowded spaces. Technology had reached a point where everything was automated, conversations were rare, and human interaction had become almost obsolete. The air shimmered with holographic projections. Streets hummed with the quiet efficiency of self-repairing nanobots, and the skies were lined with towering structures that defied gravity. Amidst this cold perfection, there was one man who felt strangely out of place: Elias Carter. Elias was an anomaly, a historian in a world that had all but erased the past. He had spent his life trying to rediscover what had been lost. Ancient books were locked away in digital vaults, and museums were nothing more than virtual simulations. To most people, history was irrelevant, a series of mistakes best forgotten. But to Elias, it was a treasure trove of stories, emotions, and lessons waiting to be uncovered. He lived in a high-rise apartment overlooking what was once New York City. Now, the city bore little resemblance to its past. The streets were suspended walkways, nature was confined to artificially created biomes, and people rarely stepped outside unless necessary. It was efficient, structured, and soulless. Late one evening, Elias sat in his dimly lit study, flipping through an old, yellowed book. A real book, something he had smuggled from an underground collector's market. The pages crinkled under his fingers, releasing a scent of time itself. It was a diary from the 21st century, a time when people still wrote their thoughts by hand, when emotions weren't filtered through neural implants, and when the world was messy but full of life. He sighed. What was it like to truly live? The thought haunted him every night. He often imagined walking down a bustling street in 2025, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, hearing the sound of real conversations, the laughter of children, the distant honk of cars, things he had only read about. Then, as if in answer to his longing, his neural implant blinked with an incoming message. Unauthorized access detected in the temporal archive. His heart skipped a beat. The temporal archive was one of the most secretive facilities in the world. A vault where fragments of lost history were stored, safeguarded from the eyes of people like him. Elias had spent years trying to find a way in, but it was nearly impossible. Until now, the message wasn't meant for him, but it had somehow reached his neural system. He traced the source. It was coming from beneath the city, from a forgotten lab buried under layers of technological evolution. Could it be? Heart pounding, he grabbed his coat and stepped out of his apartment. The silent city stretched before him, bathed in an artificial glow. The air was crisp, manufactured to perfection, but he longed for the imperfections of an older time. And tonight he might just find them. Elias moved swiftly through the empty corridors of the floating city. His neural implant buzzed with warnings. Unauthorized movement detected. Rerouting security drones. He ignored them. The city's surveillance systems were formidable, but they weren't perfect. After all, they had been designed to monitor productivity, not curiosity. He reached a transportation hub, a sleek, silver platform where anti-gravity pods hovered in waiting. With a quick override of his implant, he hijacked a pod and input the coordinates he had traced from the mysterious message. Destination: Subterranean Zone 117, Level 0. The pod hummed as it descended. Most people in 3025 had no idea that beneath the pristine floating cities, remnants of an older world still existed, buried beneath steel and forgotten by time. As the pod reached the lowest level, Elias felt a strange chill. The doors slid open, revealing darkness. Unlike the bright, sterilized world above, this place was untouched by automated maintenance. Dust particles floated in the dim light of emergency beacons. Wires hung loosely from the ceiling, and old machinery stood like ancient relics, whispering of an era long gone. Then he saw it. A massive vault door, rusted and covered in faded markings. Temporal Research Division. His breath hitched. The temporal archive wasn't just a collection of historical data. This was something bigger, something dangerous. He approached the control panel, brushing off years of dust. Unlike modern touch interfaces, this one required physical input. Keypad, a relic from the past. He hesitated. Then, almost instinctively, he typed 2025. The panel flickered. A soft beep. Then, with a groan that echoed through the chamber, the vault door unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with age. The room was lined with ancient computers and glass tubes filled with a faint, blue glow. He approached a central console, its screen blinking with a message, Time displacement experiment 1139. Status. Awaiting activation. Elias's mind raced. Was this a time machine? He reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed activate. Alarms blared. Lights flickered. A deep vibration shook the floor. The air around him seemed to bend, rippling like water. A whirlwind of light erupted from the central chamber, pulling at him like a silent storm. And then darkness, silence, falling. A weightless sensation gripped him. He was being dragged through time. His last thought before the world vanished was simple yet profound. I'm going to 2025. A cold breeze brushed against Elias's face, sending a shiver down his spine. He groaned, his body aching as though he had been tossed around like a rag doll. His fingers grasped at something unfamiliar, grass. He opened his eyes. The sky above was blue, not the artificial, controlled sky of 3025, but a vast, endless expanse of real atmosphere, speckled with drifting white clouds. He blinked in disbelief. The air smelled different, fresh, earthy, alive. Elias sat up, taking in his surroundings. He was in the middle of a park, surrounded by towering trees, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. Birds chirped overhead, their melodies foreign yet comforting. In the distance, he heard the hum of cars, the chatter of people, the muffled sound of city life. This was no simulation, no controlled environment. This was real. I did it, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm in 2025. A mixture of excitement and fear coursed through him. He had traveled 1,000 years into the past. He was no longer surrounded by cold metal walls and soulless technology. He was here, in the messy, unpredictable world he had dreamed of. But now came the hard part, survival. He reached for his neural implant out of habit, but the familiar interface was gone. His body felt different, lighter, more vulnerable. He had no access to information, no digital assistance, no futuristic enhancements. I'm just another man now. Panic threatened to creep in, but he forced himself to breathe. He had read countless books about life in this era, he just had to blend in. He needed a plan. First, he had to figure out where he was. A group of joggers passed by, talking casually. Their voices were clear, unfiltered by neural implants. He focused on their conversation, trying to catch a clue. Yeah, Central Park is packed today. The weather's perfect. Central Park. His heart skipped a beat. He was in New York City. The real New York, not the floating version from his time. His mind raced. He had no money, no identification, no connections. Just the clothes on his back, dark slacks, a simple white shirt, and a jacket that looked too sleek for this time period. He needed to blend in before someone noticed him. He stood up and dusted himself off, watching how people walked, how they moved. Casual, confident, relaxed. He tried to mimic them, one step at a time. As he strolled through the park, he caught his reflection in a storefront window. His clothes weren't too futuristic, but his posture, his eyes, they held the weight of someone who didn't belong. Before he could overthink, a voice called out, "Hey, you look lost." Elias turned sharply. A young woman stood a few feet away, holding a cup of coffee, her eyes filled with curiosity. She had dark hair tied in a messy bun, and she wore a leather jacket over a casual t-shirt. He hesitated. Should he talk to her or walk away? Then she smiled. First time in the city? Elias took a deep breath. This was his moment. Yeah, he said, forcing a smile. Something like that. The young woman tilted her head, studying Elias with an amused glint in her eyes. You have that wide-eyed tourist look. First time in New York. Elias hesitated. How was he supposed to explain his situation? He couldn't exactly say, actually, I'm from the year 3025, and I just time-traveled here by accident. So he did what any historian would do when faced with uncertainty. He improvised. Yeah, he said, forcing a sheepish smile. First time. She laughed, taking a sip of her coffee. Welcome to the jungle, then. I'm Claire. Elias, he replied, extending his hand. Felt oddly formal, but she shook it anyway. Claire gestured toward the busy street beyond the park. So what brings you here? Business? Vacation? Witness protection? She smirked at the last part. Elias scrambled for an answer. Just exploring. Seeing what life is like in the city. She raised an eyebrow. No phone? No backpack? You're either really adventurous, or you lost everything at JFK. He swallowed. In this time, everyone had a phone. A device he had only read about in archives. He needed to act fast. My bag was stolen. Lost my phone too. Her smirk faded. That sucks. New York can be rough. You need cash. Elias was caught off guard. People in 3025 weren't exactly generous. Everything was transactional, automated. But Claire's offer seemed genuine. I know, I'll figure it out. She shrugged. Suit yourself. But at least let me point you in the right direction. Where are you staying? Another question he didn't have an answer for. Think, Elias. Actually, I haven't found a place yet. Claire gave him a look. You're telling me you came to New York with no hotel, no money, and no phone? Elias exhaled. He was already messing up. It's complicated. Claire sighed. Complicated is my middle name. Look, I don't usually do this, but you seem harmless enough. There's a cafe nearby where my friend works. They might let you use their Wi-Fi, maybe even hook you up with some food. Sound good? Elias nodded, relief washing over him. That would be great. She motioned for him to follow. As they walked, Elias marveled at everything. The city was loud, chaotic, full of life. People shouted into their phones. Taxis honked. Music spilled from storefronts. It was nothing like 3025. Claire noticed his expression. You really are new to this, huh? He chuckled. You have no idea. As they approached a small coffee shop with warm lights spilling onto the street, Elias felt something he hadn't in a long time. Excitement. He was in 2025, and his adventure was just beginning. The cafe was a small, cozy spot tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop. A neon sign above the entrance read Maggie's Brew. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods drifted out as Claire held the door open for Elias. Welcome to the best coffee in New York, she said. Elias stepped inside, his senses overwhelmed by the atmosphere. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced firsthand. Warm lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, and the sound of people talking. Real conversations. No neural implants, no silent communication, just voices, laughter, and life. Claire led him to the counter where a barista, a tall guy with curly hair and a half apron, was wiping down the espresso machine. He glanced up, grinning when he saw Claire. Hey Claire, you finally bringing in business. Funny Adam, she shot back. I need a favor. My friend here lost his phone and all his stuff. Think he can chill here for a bit? Adam raised an eyebrow, giving Elias a once-over. Rough first day in the city? Elias nodded, playing along. You could say that. Adam shrugged. As long as he doesn't scare away my regulars, he's good. He grabbed a mug and started pouring coffee. You take sugar? Elias hesitated. Real coffee. He had read about it, studied its significance in history, but he had never actually tasted it. By 3025, caffeine had been replaced by synthetic energy boosters. Claire nudged him. Earth to Elias. Sugar. Yes, please. Adam slid the mug over. On the house. Consider it a proper New York welcome. Elias wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic. The heat seeped into his fingers, grounding him in this moment. He took a sip and his eyes widened. The taste was rich, slightly bitter, smooth. It was nothing like the flavorless nutrient packs of the future. He took another sip, savoring it. Claire smirked. You drink coffee like you've never had it before. Elias quickly set the mug down, just appreciating the moment. Claire eyed him curiously. So what's your deal? You said it's complicated, but you don't seem like your average lost tourist. Elias hesitated. He needed a story, something believable. I'm a historian, he said carefully. I study the past. I wanted to experience life firsthand. without modern distractions. It wasn't exactly a lie. Claire nodded slowly. Okay, that actually makes sense. You're like one of those digital detox guys who tries to live like it's the 90s or something. Something like that, Elias said, relieved she had come to her own conclusion. Adam leaned on the counter. Well, historian or not, you need cash if you're going to survive in New York. He glanced at Claire. Think your cousin's still hiring at the bookstore? Claire snapped her fingers. Oh yeah, the place next door, Paige Turner. My cousin Maddie manages it. She's always looking for part-timers. She looked at Elias. How do you feel about books? Elias nearly laughed. If only they knew. I love books, he said. Great. Let's get you a job, time traveler. Claire grinned, finishing her coffee. Elias smiled back, but inside, his mind raced. He had landed in 2025. He had shelter, a hot drink, and now possibly a job. But how long could he keep up the act? And more importantly, was he really stuck here? Claire led Elias out of the cafe, the door chiming softly behind them. The city was alive with motion. Cars honking, pedestrians weaving through the sidewalks, vendors shouting about fresh bagels. The air smelled of roasted peanuts and something fried. Elias absorbed everything with quiet fascination. This was life. Messy, unpredictable, imperfect. And yet, he felt something he had never felt in 3025, connected. Claire nudged him. You good? Or did that coffee hit you too hard? He snapped out of his daze. I'm good. She grinned and motioned toward the bookstore next door. A painted sign above the door read, Paige Turner Books. The large window display featured a variety of novels, mystery, romance, history. Elias' heart skipped a beat. A real bookstore. The door jingled as they entered. Inside, the scent of aged paper and ink filled the air. Wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stacked with books in every direction. A rolling ladder was attached to one of the walls, and a small counter at the back had an old-fashioned cash register. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a sweater and glasses, glanced up from behind the counter. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose ponytail. She adjusted her glasses. Claire, you bringing me another charity case? Claire rolled her eyes. Maddie, meet Elias. He's looking for a job, and I figured you could use the help. Maddie studied Elias for a moment. Retail experience? Elias hesitated. Not exactly, but he's a historian, Claire added. Knows a lot about books. Maddie leaned back, crossing her arms. Historian, huh? What's your favorite book? Elias' mind raced. He had read thousands of books in archives, but what would someone from this era expect? He took a chance. The Great Gatsby. Maddie smirked. Cliché, but respectable. You know how to use a cash register. Elias looked at the ancient-looking machine on the counter. He had read about these. No AI assistants, no digital retina scans. Just buttons and numbers. I can learn, he said. Maddie sighed. Fine. Minimum wage, part-time. You'll restock shelves, ring up customers, and take inventory. Don't mess up the alphabetizing, or I'll throw you into the Hudson. Elias grinned. Got it. Claire clapped him on the back. Congrats, time traveler. You're officially employed. Elias couldn't believe it. He had stepped into 2025 with nothing. Now he had a place to be, a chance to live in history. As Maddie handed him a name tag, he realized something else. For the first time in his life, he had a future. The hours at Paige Turner Books passed in a blur. Elias quickly learned how to operate the old-fashioned cash register, shelve books in proper alphabetical order, and help customers find titles. It was overwhelming at first. No neural implants, no digital assistants, no AI suggestions. Everything had to be done manually. And yet, he loved it. People actually talked to each other here. Customers asked for recommendations, exchanged opinions about books, and even debated over the best authors. In 3025, knowledge was just data, downloaded instantly, processed, and discarded. But here, books meant something. They were experiences, memories, pieces of history that people held in their hands. Maddie was strict but fair. teaching him the ropes with a mix of sarcasm and patience. Claire, meanwhile, stopped by frequently, teasing him about his awkward attempts to fit in. By the end of his shift, Elias felt drained, but in a way that was satisfying. As he stepped outside, the evening air wrapped around him. The streets were still buzzing with life, neon signs flickering, taxis whizzing by. He had no idea where he would sleep tonight, but that didn't bother him as much as it should have. Claire leaned against the bookstore's entrance, sipping another coffee. "So, how was your first day as a 2025 working man?" Elias smiled. "It was incredible," she laughed. "Dude, it's just retail." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that." Claire studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure him out. "You're weird. I like that." She finished her coffee and stretched. "So, where are you crashing tonight?" Elias hesitated. He had no money for a hotel, no ID, no past, just the present. Claire sighed. "Come on, let's go." He frowned. "Go where?" "My couch." Elias blinked. "You're inviting me to stay?" She rolled her eyes. "You act like I'm offering you a kidney. Look, you clearly don't have a place, and I don't feel like leaving you to sleep on a bench. Just don't be a serial killer. Okay?" Elias chuckled. "I promise I'm not." Claire smirked. "Cool. Now hurry up before I change my mind." As they walked through the city, Elias felt something strange, something unfamiliar yet comforting. For the first time since arriving in 2025, he wasn't just watching history. He was living it. Elias followed Claire through the bustling streets of New York, absorbing every detail. The flashing billboards, the scent of food from street vendors, the rhythmic thump of distant music. He couldn't believe how alive everything felt. Claire led him to a modest walk-up apartment in Brooklyn. The building had an old charm, with chipped paint on the stair railings and the faint scent of baked goods lingering in the hall. She unlocked her door, motioning for him to step inside. "Welcome to Casa de Claire," she said, flicking on the lights. The apartment was small but cozy, a single-bedroom unit with a couch, a cluttered coffee table, and walls lined with books and posters of old movies. The kitchen was tucked into a corner, dishes piled in the sink. Elias took it all in, fascinated. In 2025, people didn't really have homes like this. Everything was sleek, minimalist, and controlled by AI. But this felt real, lived in. Claire tossed her bag onto a chair. "Make yourself comfortable. Couch is all yours." Elias sat down, running his hand over the fabric. It wasn't sleek or sterile, it was soft, worn, full of history. Claire grabbed a blanket from the hall closet and tossed it at him. "Don't snore," he chuckled. "I'll try." She hesitated for a moment, then gave him a curious look. "You're kind of an enigma. You know that?" Elias smirked. "I get that a lot." She shook her head, amused. "Well, don't disappear in the morning. You still owe me a proper explanation." She retreated to her room, leaving Elias alone. He lay back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion settling in. And for the first time since arriving in 2025, he felt something strange and wonderful. He felt at home. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional honk of a distant car and the soft hum of a fan in the corner. Elias lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. He had time-traveled 1,000 years into the past. He was working in a bookstore. He had made a friend. And now he had a couch to sleep on. It was surreal. In 2025, life had been predictable, structured, efficient, controlled. Every decision was optimized by AI, every movement tracked. People rarely talked, rarely felt the need to connect. But here, everything was messy, unpredictable, imperfect. And he loved it. The warmth of the blanket, the distant sound of music from a neighbor's apartment, the slightly uneven springs of the couch. It all made him feel alive. Yet, beneath the excitement, a thought gnawed at him. What if I can't get back? Was he truly stuck in 2025? Or was there a way home? And if there was, did he even want to leave? He had spent years studying history, longing to experience what life used to be. Now that he was here, did he really want to return to a world of silent cities and cold technology? He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under. For now, he would rest. Tomorrow, he would figure it out. A soft knock woke him. "Hey, time traveler." Elias groggily opened his eyes. Claire stood in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, holding out a cup of coffee. "You're up early," he mumbled. She smirked. "It's 8 a.m. You're the one who slept in." He sat up, rubbing his face. He had slept better than he had in years. Claire handed him the coffee. "So, you sticking around? Or is this a one-time favor?" Elias looked at the steaming cup in his hands, then at Claire, then at the world outside the window. He took a deep breath. "I think I'm staying. For now." Elias sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. The bitter taste still caught him off guard, but he was beginning to appreciate it. Real coffee. No artificial enhancements, no synthetic energy boosters, just coffee. Claire leaned against the kitchen counter, watching him with a smirk. "You drink that like it's a religious experience." Elias chuckled. "Maybe it is." She shook her head. "All right, history boy. If you're sticking around, you need a plan." Plan. That was something Elias had never needed in 3025. His entire life had been pre-programmed, optimized for efficiency. But here, everything was uncertain. Claire continued, "You've got a job at the bookstore. That's a start. But you need more than that. An ID, a bank account, a place of your own eventually." Elias nodded. "I know. So, where do you actually come from?" Claire asked, raising an eyebrow. "And don't give me that just exploring nonsense. You act like you've never seen a coffee shop before." Elias hesitated. He had been avoiding this conversation, but Claire was sharp. She wasn't going to let it go. "It's complicated." She rolled her eyes. "You keep saying that." He took a deep breath. "What if I told you I wasn't from around here? That I came from far away?" Claire folded her arms. "How far?" Elias held her gaze. 1,000 years. Silence. Claire stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she burst out laughing. "Okay, good one. You had me for a second." Elias didn't laugh. Her smile faded. "Wait, you're serious?" He nodded. Claire set down her coffee. "Elias, if this is some weird method acting thing, you can drop it." "I wish it were," he said softly. She studied him, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of deception. "Prove it." Elias exhaled. "I don't have any records. No digital footprint. No ID. I knew how to use a cash register, but I didn't know how to order coffee. And I reacted to everything in this city like I had never seen it before." Claire frowned. "That just makes you sound like some off-the-grid survivalist." Elias leaned forward. "Ask me something about the future. Anything." She thought for a moment. "All right, what's the world like in 3025? Elias hesitated, then answered honestly. "Quiet. Too quiet. Cities are sterile, controlled, efficient, but empty. No one talks anymore. People communicate through neural implants. Every decision is optimized by AI. There's no real human interaction. No laughter. No bookstores. No Claire offering coffee to a complete stranger." Claire's expression softened. "That sounds awful." Elias nodded. "It is." She was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "Okay, let's say I believe you, what now? You trying to get back?" That was the question, wasn't it? Elias thought about the sterile world he had left behind. The empty streets, the cold perfection. Then he thought about this moment. Coffee in his hands, the smell of toast from Claire's kitchen, the distant sound of traffic outside. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back. He looked at Claire and smiled. "I think I just want to live." Claire shook her head, laughing softly. "Well, history boy, you picked one hell of a place to start." Elias smiled. Maybe he had. The days passed, and Elias slowly adjusted to life in 2025. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of the city. The honking cars, the distant hum of subway trains, the occasional shouted conversation between neighbors. It was chaotic, noisy, and utterly fascinating. He had developed a routine. Wake up, drink coffee with Claire, who insisted he wasn't human until he had caffeine, and head to Page-Turner books for his shift. Maddie, though skeptical of his odd quirks, had warmed up to him. "You're weird, but you're good with customers. That's all I need." And the customers? They were unlike anything Elias had ever encountered. Some came in looking for specific titles, others wandered aimlessly, getting lost among the shelves. He loved watching people interact with books, not just as information, but as experiences. They flipped through pages, smelled the paper, ran their fingers over old spines. One elderly man came in every afternoon, ordering tea and reading near the window. He never spoke much, just nodded at Elias in acknowledgement. A woman in her 20s would visit every week, asking for recommendations on fantasy novels. Every day, Elias learned something new about life in this time, like how money worked. Maddie had helped him set up a bank account using a mix of legal loopholes and don't ask too many questions workarounds. Claire had given him an old smartphone, laughing as she explained how to text. And most importantly, he learned how to blend in. He no longer stared in wonder at neon signs or flinched when hearing a car horn. He could order food without Claire coaching him. He had even memorized the subway map. One evening, as he and Claire walked home from work, she nudged him. "You know, for a time traveler, you're starting to fit in pretty well." Elias smiled. "I'm learning," she smirked. "Still not convinced you're actually from the future, but hey, I like the mystery." They turned the corner, the city lights stretching before them, reflecting off the pavement after a light drizzle. Elias breathed it all in. For the first time since arriving in 2025, he wasn't worried about how to get back. He was just living, and it felt right. Elias had started to feel comfortable in 2025. Maybe too comfortable. Every morning, he woke up on Claire's couch, sipping coffee as the city outside roared to life. He worked at Page-Turner books, laughed at Claire's sarcastic remarks, and spent his evenings exploring the small wonders of a world that felt alive. But deep down, there was a nagging thought that never truly went away. He was not from here. And if time travel existed, if he had somehow been thrown backward into history, did that mean there was a way back? One evening, he sat in the bookstore, flipping through an old physics journal Maddie had ordered for a customer. The articles covered quantum mechanics, wormholes, and time dilation. It was basic compared to the knowledge of 3025, but he read every word, searching for anything that hinted at what had happened to him. The problem was, he still didn't know how he had traveled back in time. Was it the machine in 3025? Had it malfunctioned and sent him here? Or was it something else? Something meant to happen? He looked around at the bookstore, at the shelves full of books that weren't digitized, locked away in virtual archives. He looked at the people talking, laughing, living. He thought about Claire, who had taken him in without asking too many questions. And for the first time, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. Did he really want to go back? The sterile, lifeless world of 3025 suddenly felt like a distant dream, a place he had escaped from, rather than been thrown out of. Maddie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Elias, you good? You've been staring at that book like it's about to explode." He blinked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." She narrowed her eyes. "Dangerous habit." Elias chuckled, closing the book. But deep inside, the weight of the future still sat heavy on his chest. For now, though, he chose to ignore it. For now, he was here. And maybe that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Elias found himself slipping deeper into life in 2025. He had settled into a routine, learned how to navigate the subway without looking lost, and even started to recognize regular customers at the bookstore. Maddie had begun trusting him enough to leave him alone in the shop. Claire still teased him about his old-fashioned mannerisms, and even Adam, the barista from Maggie's Brew, had started calling him Professor whenever he ordered coffee. It was a life, a real one, and yet the past, or rather the future, refused to let him go. One night, he found himself unable to sleep. The city outside hummed with distant sirens and the occasional car horn. But inside Claire's apartment, all was still. Elias sat on the couch, staring at his hands. They felt different now. In 3025, he had rarely even looked at them. Everything was handled by technology, holograms, neural implants, automation. He had never needed to work with his hands. Never needed to lift a box, stock a shelf, or touch the pages of a real book. But now, his hands were rougher, stronger. They had held paperbacks, coffee cups, subway railings. They had flipped through physical pages of history instead of swiping through digitized archives. He wasn't just studying history anymore. He was living it, and that realization shook him. Because if he had truly, completely adjusted to life here, did that mean he had already lost the future? Or worse, did he want to? He exhaled and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Would the past ever let him go? Or had it always been waiting for him to return? The next morning, he woke up to Claire tossing a pillow at his face. "Rise and shine, time traveler," he groaned. "Is it morning already?" Claire smirked. "It is in this century." Elias sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You never let that go, do you?" "Not a chance." She tossed him a bagel. "Eat up. We're opening early today." He caught it, smiling. And just like that, the future didn't seem so urgent anymore. For now, all that mattered was today. Elias had never felt time move like this before. Back in 3025, days were measured in efficiency metrics, how many tasks completed, how optimized his schedule was. But here, time wasn't something to track. It was something to experience. The morning rush at page-turner books brought in familiar faces. The elderly man who always sat by the window. The young woman who devoured fantasy novels like oxygen. The couple who argued playfully about which classics were actually worth reading. And Elias? He was part of it now. He had memorized the way people spoke, how they used their hands when they got excited about a book, the way they laughed when Maddie made a sarcastic remark. It was a living, breathing world. And then, just when he thought he had settled into this new life, something happened that sent a shiver down his spine. The book that shouldn't exist that afternoon. Elias was restocking shelves when Maddie called out. "Hey, history boy, got a special order for you." He wiped his hands on his apron and walked over. "Special order?" She slid a book across the counter. "Yeah, some guy ordered this, but he never picked it up. It's been sitting here for weeks. Thought you might want to look before I put it back in stock." Elias picked it up and felt his stomach drop. The title read, "The Lost Future. A Study of Temporal Anomalies." The author's name? Dr. Elias Carter. His hands trembled. He flipped open the cover. The first page had a publication date, 2028. 3 years from now. He felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. This was impossible. Maddie raised an eyebrow. "You okay? You look like you just saw a ghost." Elias forced a smile. "Yeah, just surprised. Never heard of this book before. And yet, somehow he had written it, or would write it. But how? Had he already changed history? Was this proof that he was meant to be here? Or was someone else pulling the strings? He swallowed hard and closed the book. For the first time since arriving in 2025, he wasn't sure if he was in control of his own story. And that terrified him. Elias couldn't stop staring at the book in his hands. His name, his words, his future. It wasn't just a book. It was a message, a ripple across time, a reminder that the past, his past, or was it the future, was still chasing him. He forced himself to breathe. He couldn't afford to panic. Not here, not in front of Maddie. She tapped her fingers on the counter. "So, you want the book or not? I was just gonna put it back on the shelf." Elias quickly tucked it under his arm. "I'll take it." Maddie shrugged. "Your call. Just don't expect me to give you the employee discount." He barely heard her. His mind was racing. Why did this book exist? How could something written in 2028 be here, now in 2025? And more importantly, what did it say? That night, after closing the shop, Elias sat alone in the dim light of Claire's apartment, the book open on the coffee table. He hesitated, his fingers resting on the first page. If he read this, would he be changing his own fate? But did he have a choice? Slowly, he turned the page. In 3025, time travel was considered a theory, nothing more than speculation in the archives of lost science. But what if it wasn't? What if history had already been altered by those who came before? This is the story of one such anomaly, a traveler lost in time, a man forced to choose between the past and the future. Elias' pulse quickened. This was about him. He flipped further, scanning paragraphs, searching for answers. Then his breath caught. If you are reading this in 2025, know that your presence here is no accident. It was always meant to happen. The key to understanding why lies not in where you came from, but in what you will choose to do next. His hands trembled. This wasn't just a book. It was a warning. But from who? And more terrifyingly, what was he supposed to choose? A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Elias! Claire's voice. He quickly shut the book, shoving it under the blanket. Yeah? Claire pushed the door open, holding 2 takeout boxes. I figured you'd still be up. Chinese or Mexican? Elias forced a smile, his heart still pounding. Chinese. She plopped down next to him, handing over a box. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. You have no idea. Elias took the food, nodding. Yeah. Just a lot on my mind. Claire smirked. Welcome to my life. She turned on the TV, flipping through channels. Elias, meanwhile, sat there with his food, pretending to be normal, pretending that everything was fine. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was coming, and whatever it was, he was running out of time. Elias barely touched his food. The weight of the book sat heavy on his mind, its presence a paradox in itself. Someone or something had written it. Someone who knew him. Someone who knew his fate. But how? Claire glanced at him between bites of her food. You're in deep thought mode again. He forced a chuckle. Just thinking about life. She gave him a look. Life's weird, but it doesn't usually make people look like they've seen a ghost. Elias hesitated. He wanted to tell her, wanted to explain everything. But how could he? She already thought his time traveler story was a joke. Instead, he sighed. I just feel like I'm being watched. Claire raised an eyebrow. By who? Maddie? Because if you screw up her book inventory again, she'll definitely be watching you. Elias smirked, but the unease didn't fade. Someone had left that book here. For him. And if that was true, then whoever had done it knew he was here. The next day at Page Turner Books, Elias tried to go about his work as usual. Stocking shelves, helping customers, organizing the new arrivals. But his mind kept drifting back to the book. Then, just after lunchtime, something strange happened. A man walked into the store. Elias didn't notice him at first. He was busy ringing up a customer. But as the man moved through the aisles, Elias felt a prickle at the back of his neck. The man was different. Tall, with sharp features and a calm, unreadable expression. He wore a long gray coat, his hands tucked into the pockets. He didn't browse, didn't look at any books. He just walked. And then he stopped, right in front of the counter. Elias swallowed. Can I help you? The man tilted his head slightly. Dr. Elias Carter. Elias froze. No one knew that name here. Not even Claire. Not even Maddie. His pulse pounded in his ears. I think you have the wrong person. The man's lips curled into a slight smile. Do I? The air around him felt too still. The store felt too quiet. Elias clenched his hands beneath the counter. Who are you? The man didn't answer. Instead, he slid something across the counter. A small slip of paper. Elias glanced at it. An address, written in neat, precise handwriting. Come find me, the man said softly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the store. Elias stood there, staring at the paper, his heart racing. Who was that man? How did he know his name? And more importantly, What was waiting for him at that address? Elias stared at the slip of paper, the address burning into his mind. 1003 Lenox Avenue, New York City. It didn't ring any bells. But then again, he barely knew the city's layout. His instinct told him to ignore it, to pretend the man in the gray coat had never walked into the store, to go back to his routine at Page-Turner Books and act like nothing had changed. But something had changed. The moment the man spoke his real name, the illusion of safety shattered. Whoever he was, he knew Elias wasn't from this time. And that meant he wasn't alone. After his shift, Elias folded the paper and stuffed it into his pocket, his mind racing. Should he tell Claire? No. He couldn't risk pulling her into this, not yet. If there was even the slightest chance that this stranger was connected to the book, to his arrival in 2025, he needed to handle it alone. That night, as Claire slept, Elias slipped out of the apartment and headed toward Lenox Avenue. The address led him to an abandoned building. The exterior was old. Weathered bricks, boarded-up windows, a rusting fire escape. It looked like no one had set foot inside in years. Elias hesitated. This felt wrong. A trap, maybe, but he had come too far to turn back now. He tried the door. Locked. Then, as if expecting him, a small red light near the handle blinked once. A quiet click followed. The door unlocked. Elias stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with dust and scattered remnants of the past. Old newspapers, discarded furniture. A clock that had stopped ticking decades ago. And in the center of the room stood the man in the gray coat. He turned slowly, hands still in his pockets, watching Elias with an unreadable expression. "You came," he said. Elias swallowed. "You knew I would." The man nodded. "You're not the first." A chill ran through Elias. "What does that mean?" The man gestured toward an old table, where a stack of familiar books sat. Elias stepped closer, his breath catching as he recognized the titles. They were all written by him. Books that hadn't been published yet. Books from a future that hadn't happened. And there, sitting on top, was a photograph. Elias picked it up, his hands shaking. The image showed him, standing in the middle of a futuristic city, wearing the very same coat as the man before him. Elias looked up, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "You already know." Elias stared at him. The realization hit like a lightning strike. He was looking at himself. An older version. A version of himself from the future. A traveler who had already made this journey before. Elias' breath came short and fast. He stared at the man, his future self, trying to grasp the impossible. The older Elias, the man in the gray coat, simply watched him, calm as if he had seen this play out before. And maybe he had. "This isn't real," Elias finally said. The man gave a faint smile. "That's what I said when it happened to me." Elias' legs felt weak. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table for support. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but only one managed to come out. "How?" Future Elias sighed, stepping forward slightly. "I don't have all the answers. Just enough." He gestured to the books, the ones written by Elias, but from a future he hadn't lived yet. "You're not here by accident, Elias. You were always meant to come back." Elias shook his head. No, I was pulled here by some kind of machine. A malfunction." Future Elias chuckled. "You still think it was an accident?" Elias clenched his fists. "If it wasn't, then why am I here? Why you? Why any of this?" Future Elias studied him carefully, then pulled something from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the table. A small, black device. Elias stepped closer, heart pounding. He recognized the shape, the design. It was from 3025. A time travel module. His hands shook as he reached for it. The cold metal felt too real. He looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is how I get back." Future Elias nodded. "Yes, but that's not why I brought you here." Elias stared at him. "Then why?" Future Elias exhaled, his gaze darkening. "Because history isn't what you think it is." Elias felt his pulse quicken. "What are you talking about?" Future Elias gestured toward the books again. You're not just a traveler, Elias. You're part of something bigger. You always have been. Elias swallowed hard. Then tell me what I need to know. Future Elias hesitated, then said softly, "The timeline is breaking." A heavy silence filled the air. Elias felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. The timeline? Future Elias continued, his voice low. You weren't just sent back in time, you were sent to the point where everything changes. 2025 is the tipping point. This is where the future is rewritten. Elias felt his hands clench. And if I do nothing? Future Elias' jaw tightened. Then everything you know, all of history, falls apart. Elias took a shaky breath. He had come to 2025 thinking he was a lost traveler. But now, he realized he was never lost at all. He had been sent here for a reason, and whatever was coming next, he had to be ready. Elias felt the room closing in around him. His future self, the man in the gray coat, stood still, waiting for him to process everything. The timeline is breaking. Those words echoed in his mind. 2025 is the tipping point. This is where the future is rewritten. Elias exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. If this moment is so important, then what happens if I fail? Future Elias' expression darkened. You don't want to know. Elias clenched his fists. Then tell me what I'm supposed to do. Future Elias stepped forward, his voice firm. You have a choice. He tapped the time module on the table. You can use this to return to 3025. Go back to your life. Forget all of this. Elias glanced at the device. The thought of going home, back to the world he had always known, was tempting. But then future Elias continued. Or you can stay, and make sure the future survives. Elias' chest tightened. How? What am I supposed to change? Future Elias sighed. There's someone you need to find. Elias' breath caught. Who? Future Elias hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Elias took it. His eyes widened. It was a picture of Claire. His voice came out hoarse. Why her? Future Elias' expression softened. Because she's more important than you realize. Elias felt his stomach twist. I don't understand. Future Elias took a slow breath. In every version of history, Claire is supposed to live an ordinary life. But in some, she doesn't. Elias swallowed hard. Something happens to her? Future Elias nodded grimly. In a timeline where you don't intervene, Claire dies. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Elias shook his head. No, that's not possible. Claire is... She's just Claire. Future Elias met his gaze. That's what I thought too, until I learned the truth. Elias forced himself to breathe. So if I stay, I can change that? Future Elias nodded. You can. But saving her might change everything. And not just for her. For history itself. Elias stared at the photograph, his hands shaking. He had spent weeks falling in love with this world. With its imperfections, its noise, its messy humanity. With the people who had taken him in. And now he realized this wasn't just about history. This was personal. He looked up, his voice steady. Then tell me what I need to do. Future Elias gave a small, knowing smile. You already know the answer. And deep down, Elias realized he did. Elias stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of time pressing down on him. In one hand, he held the time module, his ticket back to 3025, back to the world he once called home. In the other, he held the photograph of Claire, the person who had given him a place to stay, who had helped him find a job, who had unknowingly become his anchor to this time. His future self watched him carefully, waiting for his decision. Elias took a shaky breath. If I stay, do I ever go back? Future Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, That's up to you. Elias glanced down at the time module. A single press of a button, and he could leave everything behind. He could wake up in 3025 like this had been nothing more than a dream. But would that be the right choice? Could he really abandon the life he had started to build here? Could he really walk away from Claire? His mind flashed back to all the moments that had led him here, the first sip of real coffee, the way people actually talked to each other, the sound of Claire's laughter, the books, not holograms, not digital files, but real books. This world was alive. And for the first time, so was he. Elias closed his eyes. He already knew the answer. He let go of the time module. It clattered onto the table, the sound echoing through the empty room. Future Elias gave a knowing nod. Good choice. Elias exhaled, the tension leaving his body. What happens now? Future Elias stepped back into the shadows. His voice was calm. Now you live. You protect what matters. And one day, when the time comes, you'll know what to do. A deep humming sound filled the air. The room shimmered, like reality itself was shifting. Elias' vision blurred. The future was leaving. Or maybe it was making room for something new. He blinked. And suddenly, the room was empty. The books, the table, the time module, all of it was gone. Like it had never existed. Elias walked back to Claire's apartment in a daze. The city felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him. Claire was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book. She looked up. Took you long enough. Elias hesitated, studying her face. The face of someone who, in another timeline, might not have existed much longer. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Not this time. He forced a smirk. Got lost. She rolled her eyes. You're always lost. He laughed softly and sat down beside her. For the first time since arriving in 2025, he wasn't thinking about the future. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere.